The moment the Alpha King rejected her, everyone believed the cursed bride would simply disappear from history. No one in the great stone hall imagined that the girl kneeling beneath the shattered moonlight would become the most terrifying queen the ancient world had ever feared. But that night, when her wedding dress tore against the cold marble floor and something ancient awakened beneath her skin, the kingdoms of wolves would learn a truth they had buried for 1,000 years. The girl they called cursed was never human, and the Alpha King who rejected her had just broken the seal of a sleeping dragon. The royal fortress of Blackthorn Keep stood like a fortress carved from the bones of the mountains themselves. Towering stone walls wrapped around the capital of the Northern Wolf Kingdom, their battlements glowing silver beneath the rising moon. Inside the fortress, hundreds of torches flickered along vast corridors carved with ancient runes of wolf kings long dead. Tonight the fortress was alive with celebration. Nobles from every pack across the northern territories filled the great hall. Fur cloaks brushed against polished armor, and the banners of rival wolf clans hung from towering pillars. The air carried the scent of roasted meat, burning cedar wood, and the restless tension that always followed political marriages. Because no one here believed this wedding was meant to last. At the far end of the hall, beneath a throne carved from black obsidian and wolf fangs, stood the man who ruled them all, Alpha King Kyle Draven. Even among wolves, Kyle Draven was something different. He was taller than most warriors in the room, broad-shouldered and unmoving like a mountain carved from iron. His dark armor was etched with silver runes of the royal bloodline, and the heavy wolf cloak draped across his shoulders was made from the pelt of the last alpha he had defeated in battle. But it was not his armor or his crown that made the hall silent whenever he moved. It was the presence of the beast inside him. The wolf of Kyle Draven was legendary across the northern kingdoms. Warriors whispered that when he shifted beneath the full moon, his wolf stood taller than war horses and could tear through an entire pack alone. He had conquered 3 rival territories before his 25th winter. He had crushed rebellions without mercy, and no one in the room tonight dared meet his eyes for long. Yet the Alpha King did not look like a man celebrating his wedding. He looked like a man waiting for a war. The heavy doors of the hall creaked open. Every conversation died instantly, because the bride had arrived. She entered slowly, escorted by 2 soldiers wearing the crimson armor of the Southern Dragon Province. Her wedding gown was white, though it had clearly been altered from something older and less regal. The fabric hung too loosely along her shoulders, as if it had been borrowed from someone who had once been meant to wear it proudly. But this girl wore it like a prisoner walking toward a sentence. Her name was Lyra Vale. Across the northern territories, people knew her by a different title, the Cursed Bride. She had arrived at Blackthorn Keep 3 months earlier as part of the fragile peace treaty between the Wolf Kingdom and the southern provinces. The treaty had ended a war that had burned for decades, and the price of that peace was Lyra, the daughter of a disgraced southern noble house, a girl rumored to carry forbidden blood, a bride the Alpha King had never asked for. As Lyra stepped into the torchlight, whispers rippled through the crowd. "Look at her. She barely looks like a noble. They say the southern priests tried to burn her when she was born. My cousin swore her shadow moves when she sleeps. She has no wolf. I heard the southern packs tested her blood." A soft laugh drifted from the nobles gathered along the right side of the hall. Standing among them was Lady Seraphine of the Iron Fang clan, a woman famous for beauty, cruelty, and her very public belief that she would one day become Luna Queen beside Kyle Draven. Seraphine's golden eyes traced Lyra slowly, her smile thin with satisfaction. "How tragic," she murmured to the noble beside her. "A cursed creature forced to pretend she belongs among wolves." Lyra heard the words, but she did not respond. She had grown used to those whispers long before she arrived in the Wolf Kingdom, because they had followed her since the night she was born. Lyra Vale had never known her mother. According to the stories whispered by frightened servants, her mother died moments after bringing her into the world. Some said the woman had screamed about fire and wings before collapsing. Others claimed the newborn child had burned the midwife's hands without touching her. The southern priests had called it a sign of corruption. They tried to cleanse the infant, but the flames refused to harm her. After that night, the rumors began. Cursed child, demon blood, forbidden lineage. Lyra grew up inside the crumbling halls of her father's estate, hidden from the public eye. Servants crossed themselves when she passed. Priests watched her from dark corners. And when she reached 16 winters, the Southern Council finally decided what to do with her. They offered her to the wolves. Now she stood alone in the center of the Northern Kingdom's Great Hall, the weight of hundreds of judging eyes pressing against her skin. Across the chamber, Alpha King Kale Draven watched her approach. His expression revealed nothing, but something inside him stirred. The moment Lyra stepped fully into the moonlight spilling through the towering windows above, Kale's wolf shifted uneasily beneath his skin. That had never happened before. Not once. His wolf had faced dragons, rival alphas, and entire battlefields without hesitation. Yet now the beast inside him was restless, alert, watching. Kyle dismissed the sensation instantly. It meant nothing. This marriage meant nothing. The southern provinces had demanded it to secure peace, and the Wolf Council had insisted it would stabilize the borders. But Kale Draven had never needed a bride to rule his kingdom, and he certainly had no intention of binding his fate to a cursed woman. Lyra reached the center of the hall and stopped. The priest of the Northern Pack stepped forward, raising a silver ceremonial blade that glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. "Tonight," the priest announced, his voice echoing across the chamber, "we witness the joining of two bloodlines. Through this union, the war between the Northern Wolf Kingdom and the Southern Provinces will finally end." His gaze moved between Kyle and Lyra. "Alpha King Kale Draven, do you accept this bride and the alliance her blood represents?" The hall held its breath. Kyle did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Lyra. For the first time since entering the hall, she looked directly at him, and something about that gaze unsettled him. She did not look frightened. She did not look hopeful. She looked resigned, as if she had already accepted the cruelty that was about to follow. A flicker of irritation crossed Kale's mind. He despised weakness. He despised pity. And he despised being forced into political games by cowards hiding behind treaties. The priest waited. "So?" Seraphine whispered softly from the crowd. "Will the great Alpha King truly bind himself to a cursed girl?" Kale finally spoke. His voice cut through the hall like a blade drawn from its sheath. "I will not." The words struck the room like thunder. Gasps erupted instantly. The priest froze. Lyra's fingers tightened against the torn fabric of her dress. But Kale had not finished. "I will not accept a cursed woman as my Luna." His voice grew colder with every word. "This marriage was demanded by cowards afraid of war. But I will not stain the bloodline of the Northern Wolves with Southern superstition." A ripple of shock spread through the nobles. The rejection had come sooner than anyone expected. Kyle stepped down from the throne dais, stopping only a few paces from Lyra. "You were sent here as a symbol of peace," he said, his voice quiet but merciless. "But you will never sit beside me as queen." The hall fell silent. Lyra slowly lowered her eyes. Around them, nobles began whispering eagerly. Some laughed. Others looked relieved. Seraphine's smile widened. The humiliation was complete. The Alpha King had rejected his bride in front of the entire royal court. For a moment, nothing moved. Then something strange happened. The torches flickered. A faint tremor passed through the stone floor beneath Lyra's feet. Kyle noticed it immediately. So did his wolf. The beast inside him growled softly. Lyra's breathing had changed. Her shoulders trembled, not with tears, with something else. Something older, something awakening. The priest frowned. "Bride," he said cautiously, "you may leave the hall." But Lyra did not move. Instead, she lifted her head slowly, and when Kale saw her eyes again, they were glowing. Not the golden glow of wolves, not the silver glow of magic, but a deep, burning crimson. For the first time that night, the Alpha King felt something dangerously close to unease. Because in that moment, every ancient instinct inside his blood whispered the same impossible truth. The girl kneeling before him was not cursed. She was sealed, and Cale Draven had just broken the lock. Lyra's eyes burned like two embers pulled from the heart of a dying star, and for one suspended, impossible heartbeat, no one in the great hall dared to breathe. The torches along the stone walls hissed and bent, as if some unseen storm had entered the chamber, though every window remained shut and every banner hung still. Cale did not step back, but every sharpened instinct inside him rose at once. His wolf, that ruthless, ancient beast that feared neither blade nor rival alpha, pressed hard against his ribs with a warning that felt almost like memory. Something in the air had changed. Something had opened, and the entire royal court, still trembling from the shock of the Alpha King's public rejection, found itself staring not at a broken bride, but at a girl whose silence had suddenly become more frightening than any scream. Lyra lowered her gaze again, as if ashamed of what had slipped through her control, and the red fire in her eyes faded by a breath, though not completely. It lingered under her lashes like banked flame. Her hands were trembling now, and Cale saw, with a cold tightening in his chest, that the veins beneath her pale skin had begun to glimmer faintly with molten gold. The sight lasted no more than a blink. Then it was gone. Several nobles gasped. One of the older councilmen crossed himself with the sign wolves used against dark sorcery. The priest stumbled a half-step backward, the silver ceremonial blade shaking in his hand. "What trick is this?" he demanded, though the force had already gone out of his voice. Lyra opened her mouth as if to answer, but what left her throat was not words. It was a broken inhale, the sound of someone trying with everything they had, not to come apart in front of enemies. Seraphine recovered first. Of course she did. Cruel women always did. She moved through the crowd with graceful certainty, silk and silver swaying around her like she had been waiting for this precise moment all evening. Her face wore concern, but her eyes glittered with triumph. "Your Majesty," she said softly, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "You see now why this marriage should never have been considered. There is something unnatural in her." The hall, hungry and frightened, seized upon her words at once. Murmurs sharpened, unnatural, demon blood, southern witch, monster. Lyra's fingers tightened harder around the torn folds of her dress until her knuckles went white. Cale should have dismissed the scene, ordered the bride confined, restored authority by force. That would have been the simplest course. Yet he could not stop looking at her. There was no madness in her expression, no scheming, no ambition, only pain, deep, old pain. And beneath it, the rigid control of someone who had spent half a lifetime learning how not to burn the world when the world deserved it. Seraphine circled closer. "Perhaps," she continued, with poisonous sweetness, "the southern provinces sent not a bride, but a weapon." At that, several warriors reached instinctively for their swords. Cale lifted one hand, and they froze. His command still ruled the room. "Enough," he said. The single word struck the hall flat. But even as silence fell again, a second tremor moved under the floor, stronger this time, rippling through the marble with a low groan that rose from deep beneath the mountain. Goblets rattled. Dust slipped from the edges of old beams. Somewhere high above, one of the moonlit windows cracked in a fine silver line. Lyra's breath hitched sharply. She looked up, not at Cale, not at the crowd, but toward the ceiling, as if hearing something no one else could hear. Something calling her. Her lips parted, and Cale saw the terror there at last. Real terror. Not of the court, not of humiliation. Of herself. Before he could speak, Lyra lurched to one side as if struck. Her knees gave way completely, and she crashed onto both hands against the marble. The sound echoed through the hall. Gasps spread. A thin, painful cry tore from her throat, and this time the strange glow did not disappear. It raced beneath her skin in branching rivers of gold and crimson, lighting the delicate bones of her hands, her throat, her collarbone. Her torn white sleeves fluttered, though no wind touched them. The air around her had begun to shimmer with heat. Kael moved without thinking. In 2 strides, he was beside her. When he reached for her shoulder, she flinched so violently he stopped inches away. "Do not touch me," she whispered, and the words were raw with panic. "Please." The plea made something inside him harden and soften at once. It was not fear for herself he heard. It was fear for everyone near her. The priest had backed nearly to the steps below the throne. "She is possessed," he shouted. "Seize her now before the curse spreads." That was the spark Seraphine needed. "Guards," she called, before Kael could countermand it. "The creature has shown its true nature. Protect your king." Steel rang from scabbards all around the hall. 6 northern warriors advanced. Kael turned, fury flashing through him. "Stand down." But fear had already infected the room, and fear made fools deaf. One guard, younger than the rest and eager to prove himself, rushed first. He seized Lyra's arm. She screamed. The instant his hand touched her skin, a burst of blinding scarlet fire exploded through the chamber. The warrior was thrown backward as if hurled by a giant. He slammed into a pillar so hard the stone cracked, then crumpled to the floor unconscious. The blast extinguished every torch in the left half of the hall. Darkness swallowed that side of the room, broken only by moonlight, and the glow now pouring from Lyra's body. Women shrieked. Nobles stumbled over one another to retreat. Warriors raised shields. Seraphine's composed mask vanished for the first time, replaced by pale disbelief. Kael did not retreat. The heat rolling off Lyra struck him like a forge door flung open, yet still he stayed. His wolf snarled, not in fear now, but in recognition. Recognition of what? He did not know. Only that the power in front of him was not the wild black rot of corrupted magic. It felt ancient, regal, furious, and wounded beyond measure. Lyra pushed herself upright with visible effort, swaying unsteadily on torn skirts. Her face was wet not with tears, Kael realized a second later, but with sweat. Her entire body was fighting to hold something back. "I tried," she whispered, though whether she spoke to him, to herself, or to some ghost from years ago, he could not tell. "I tried not to let it out." Another crack spidered across the high window. Then, another. Somewhere beyond the walls of Blackthorn Keep, wolves began to howl, not in challenge, but in confusion and fear. Kael's gaze sharpened. He had heard those howls before only twice in his life. Once when an elder beast rose from hibernation beneath the ice fields, and once when a dying prophet spoke in tongues during the last blood moon. The wolves of the fortress sensed something vast, something old enough to be remembered by instinct alone. "Everyone out," Kael ordered. His voice thundered through the hall. Now. This time they obeyed. Panic finally found direction. Nobles fled through the side passages, clutching jewels and robes, shoving one another in blind haste. Councilmen stumbled after them, shouting prayers and accusations. The priest vanished almost before anyone else, taking his silver blade with him. Only Seraphine lingered near the steps, eyes fixed on Lyra with a hatred sharpened by sudden fear. Kael noticed her too late. From within the sleeve of her ceremonial gown she drew a narrow dagger of moon silver, slender as a fang. "If she is a monster," Seraphine hissed, "then let the curse die now." She threw the blade. Kael moved at once, but Lyra moved first. Not quickly, not with trained reflexes, with instinct. Her body twisted to shield itself, and the dagger sank not into her heart, but into the flesh just below her ribs. The silver bit deep. Lyra gasped and staggered. For one silent beat, the whole world seemed to stop. Then the mountain roared. The force that erupted from her knocked Kael backward 3 paces, though he kept his feet. Every remaining torch went black. The windows shattered inward in a storm of glass and moonlight. The chandeliers overhead snapped from their chains and crashed onto the marble in showers of sparks. Heat flooded the hall so suddenly that banners caught fire where they hung. Seraphine screamed and fell, covering her face. Lyra's body arched in impossible pain, both hands flying to the wound in her side. But instead of blood, Golden fire spilled between her fingers, not burning her, escaping her. Kael stared, every battle instinct rendered useless before something no sword had ever taught him how to face. Beneath the fire, symbols appeared on Lyra's skin. They spread from the wound outward in curling, ancient lines that looked less like magic and more like language carved by flame itself. Runes, old beyond old. Kael knew war marks, Luna markings, the moon-born scripts of his own royal line. These were none of them. Yet somewhere in the deep locked vaults of memory passed down through blood and story, he felt the echo of what they meant. Not curse, not corruption. Sovereign. The words slammed through him with terrible certainty. Lyra sank to one knee again, clutching at the dagger still embedded in her side. And when she lifted her face to him, her expression was not monstrous. It was pleading. "Run," she said. "Please." A harsh breath shook her. "Before it sees you." It. The pronoun chilled him more than the heat ever could. "What sees me?" he demanded, stepping toward her. She shook her head in misery, unable or unwilling to answer. Then Kael smelled it. Not blood, not wolf, not human fear, but smoke, ancient smoke. Smoke from caverns and scorched gold and old bones sleeping beneath mountains. His wolf went dead silent. The sudden stillness of the beast frightened Kael more than any snarl could have, because his wolf did not submit, to no rival, to no king, to nothing. Yet now, it was listening. The hall ceiling groaned. Stone dust rained down. Outside, the fortress bells began ringing as sentries shouted from the battlements. Something had risen over Blackthorn Keep. He could hear it in their voices. Not attack, terror. Kael reached Lyra, just as another wave of power tore through her. This one did not throw him back. Instead, it wrapped around him in a storm of heat and sound. Images flashed behind his eyes. A tower of flame, wings wider than castle walls, a crown of black and gold, a woman standing in the middle of a battlefield while wolves and men alike knelt in ash before her. Then the vision was gone, and Kael found himself gripping Lyra's shoulders despite her warning. Her skin was burning hot, but it did not consume him. It only seared through the leather of his gloves. "Lyra," he said, his voice lower now, steadier, as if speaking to a terrified beast in pain. "Look at me." She did. For an instant he saw two selves fighting behind her gaze, the fragile bride everyone had mocked, and something vast coiled behind her eyes, like a sleeping inferno beginning to wake. A horn blasted outside. Then another. Kael heard boots pounding in the corridor. His captain, Rowan, burst through the broken side doors with a squad of royal guards. He stopped dead at the sight before him. The destroyed hall, the burning tapestries, the shattered windows, and at the center of it all, the rejected bride glowing like the core of a furnace, while the Alpha King stood over her instead of killing her. Rowan's sword came halfway out. "Your Majesty, no one touches her," Kael snapped. The captain froze, stunned. Around him, the guards exchanged uncertain looks. They could smell the power in the room. They could hear the mountain trembling. They wanted clear enemies. There were none. "Seal the hall," Kael ordered. "Evacuate the fortress levels beneath us. No one comes near this chamber without my command." Rowan hesitated only a breath before nodding. Loyalty won over fear. He turned and began barking orders. On the floor beside the shattered dais, Seraphine dragged herself up against a pillar, hair disheveled, her elegant face streaked with dust, and a line of blood where flying glass had cut her temple. Hatred blazed in her eyes now, with no effort to conceal it. "You cannot mean to protect her," she spat. "Look at what she is." Kael did not take his eyes off Lyra. "I know exactly what she is not," he said coldly. "She is not the one who threw a blade in my hall." Seraphine's face went white, then red with rage. "I did what your council should have done months ago, and nearly brought my fortress down around us," Kael said. "Pray, that is the worst of what your ambition has caused." If he had looked at her then, truly looked, He might have seen the tiny flicker of fear beneath her fury, the fear of a woman who realized she had not merely failed to kill her rival, but awakened something that might now destroy them all. Lyra's fingers closed weakly around his wrist. The contact jolted him. Her grip was burning, but no longer uncontrolled. "There's a chamber," she whispered, each word scraping out of her like it hurt to speak. "Under the keep. Old stone. Deep enough." Cale frowned. "How do you know that?" Her eyes unfocused briefly, as if she were listening to someone whispering inside the walls. "I don't know. I just know." Another shudder ran through her body. Golden light bled from beneath her shoulder blades now, outlining shapes that made Cale's blood run cold. Not magic. Structure. Something forming. Bones that did not belong to a human woman. Wings. "Move," Cale ordered. He slid one arm around her waist and hauled her upward just as the carved wolf throne behind them split in two from the pressure of the power building in the room. The sound was like thunder. Guards shouted. Stones fell from the ceiling in chunks now. Rowan rushed back to them. "The lower vaults are clear." Cale nodded once. "With me." Seraphine pushed away from the pillar in disbelief. "You would take that thing beneath the heart of the fortress? Better there than among fleeing nobles?" Cale said. "Lock Lady Seraphine in the East Tower. She leaves only when I say." Her mouth opened in outrage, but Rowan was already moving. Two guards seized her arms. She shrieked Cale's name. Then curses, then promises of what the council would do when he came to his senses. He ignored every word. They half-led, half-carried Lyra through a hidden corridor behind the throne wall, down spiraling stone steps used in older wars as escape routes for the royal line. The deeper they went, the more unstable the magic around her became. Heat washed through the passage in waves. Old iron sconces dripped. Moss along the stones blackened as if winter and summer had passed over it in a single breath. Cale felt every muscle in Lyra straining against herself. She was still trying to contain it, still trying not to become whatever waited beyond the edges of her skin. The realization struck him with unexpected force. She had not wanted to destroy his hall. She had been protecting them from something worse. "How long?" he asked quietly as they descended. Her voice was barely there. "Since I was 12. "You have held this back since you were 12? She gave the tiniest nod. The southern priests bounded. They called it mercy. Cale's jaw tightened. He had seen mercy used as a prettier word for torture too many times to believe in the priest's version of it. They reached the vault chamber at the lowest level of the keep, a circular room cut from mountain rock, older than the kingdom itself. Chains once used for ancient war beasts still hung from iron rings in the walls. Massive doors of black oak bound in silver stood open behind them. Moonlight could not reach this place. Only torch fire and the terrible radiance spilling from Lyra's skin lit the cavernous chamber. Cale guided her to the center. The instant he let go, she dropped to her knees, head bowed, hands pressed to the stone. "Go," she whispered again, "before I can't tell what's mine anymore." He did not move. Rowan, standing near the doorway with 3 guards, looked as if he wished to argue and flee at the same time. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "if this thing becomes hostile, then these doors will not stop it," Cale answered. His voice was flat because truth required no drama. Lyra made a broken sound that might once have been a laugh. "At least," she murmured, "you're honest." Cale crouched in front of her. The wound in her side had closed around the moon-silver dagger, but the flesh around it had blackened in strange crystalline patterns. He reached toward the hilt. "No," she gasped, seizing his wrist with sudden strength. "Not yet. Silver weakens the binding. If you pull it out now." She stopped as a violent tremor racked her spine. Cale understood. The blade was the final crack in the seal. Remove it, and whatever ancient force had been caged in her blood would have nothing left to restrain it. He should have ordered chains. He should have treated her like a threat. Yet kneeling in front of her now, seeing the pain in the face of a woman who had been discarded and weaponized her whole life, all he felt was a savage, unfamiliar urge to protect. "Tell me what you are," he said. Lyra raised her head slowly. In the low firelight, her face seemed both younger and older than before. Younger in its naked suffering. Older in the shadows moving behind her eyes. "I don't know all of it," she admitted. "Only fragments. Dreams, voices, fire, a city buried in ash, a queen with wings." Her mouth trembled once, though she mastered it quickly. "The priests said my blood came from a forgotten line the world was right to erase." Kyle's gaze sharpened. "Forgotten by whom?" "By wolves," she whispered. "By kings, by everyone who survived them." Rowan and the guards exchanged grim looks. Ancient enemies, ancient monsters. Those stories filled nursery warnings and battlefield songs alike. Dragons belonged to the oldest legends, to the age before wolf kingdoms, before men named mountains and claimed rivers. But legends were bones. They did not bleed in wedding gowns before you. A sound rolled through the chamber then, not from above, not from the corridor, but from Lyra herself. A deep resonance. The beginning of a growl too large for a human throat. Every guard drew steel. Rowan stepped forward. Kale lifted one hand sharply. "No." Lyra's fingers dug into the rock hard enough to split skin. "It's waking," she said through clenched teeth. "When I was a child, I could only hear it. Then I could feel it when I bled. Then when I was afraid. But tonight." She squeezed her eyes shut as two great ridges of golden light swelled beneath the skin of her back. "Tonight, you broke the last vow." Kale's brow darkened. "What vow?" Her eyes flew open again, blazing crimson. "The vow that no king of wolves would ever claim me, and no dragon would ever rise in his court." The words hit him like prophecy spoken too late. Around them, the torches bent inward, all flame pulling toward Lyra, as if recognizing a greater fire. Then the doors above boomed. Once, twice, a third time. Rowan spun toward them. "The council," he snarled. They brought more guards. Kale's expression went cold. Of course they had. Panic traveled faster than truth in every court. The nobles would already be whispering that the Alpha King had hidden a demon beneath the fortress. The council would want her dead before dawn, treaty or no treaty. "Hold them," Kale ordered Rowan. "No one enters." The captain hesitated only a second, then signaled his men and moved to brace the doors. The pounding grew louder. Voices echoed from the other side. Priests, councilmen, frightened commands. Words like abomination and execution, and cleanse it now. Lyra heard them all. Kale saw it in her face. The old helplessness returned for one brutal instant, and with it something darker. Rage. Not wild rage. The kind that forms when pain is repeated until it becomes structure. "They always come with chains," she whispered. "Or fire." Kale looked at her steadily. "Not tonight." Something changed in her at that. Not trust. Trust did not bloom that quickly in women made into offerings, but surprise. Deep and painful surprise. As if no one had ever stood between her and the mob before. The pounding on the doors became frantic now. Silver bolts screamed as they were tested from the other side. Lyra bowed over suddenly with a cry torn from the very base of her lungs. The ridges along her back split through silk and skin in a spray of glowing sparks. Kale heard bone lengthening. Heard it. Wings burst from her shoulders in half-formed arcs of ember and scale. Not fully flesh yet, but no longer only power either. Rowan cursed under his breath. One of the younger guards dropped his sword and stumbled back against the wall, white-faced. Lyra collapsed forward onto both hands, breathing in harsh, ragged pulls, as those impossible appendages twitched and spread behind her, casting vast, jagged shadows across the chamber walls. Kale had faced battlefields knee-deep in dead. He had torn out the throat of a rival alpha beneath a blood moon. He had watched men burn in siege fire and never once mistaken strength for beauty. Yet what he saw now was terrible and beautiful at once. Not because it was safe, because it was true. Something in Lyra was becoming visible that had never been allowed to exist in daylight. Scale patterns shimmered across the back of her neck. dark bronze edged in crimson. Her hands, still braced on stone, had changed too. The nails lengthened into black curved talons before retreating again halfway as she fought for control. Kael knew at once why the priests had called her cursed. Power like this terrified weak men. It could not be married off, contained, or politely ignored. So they named it evil and wrapped it in shame until even its bearer believed them. The great doors shuddered again. A bolt snapped. Voices shouted triumph. Rowan planted himself before the gap, sword raised. "We do not have long." Lyra laughed once, breathless and shattered. "Neither do I." Then she looked up at Kael, with eyes so red they seemed lit from within. "If they come in while it's half awake, it will kill everything that moves." "Then wake it fully," he said. The words left him before caution could stop them. Rowan stared at him as if he had gone mad. Even Lyra went still. "You don't understand what you're saying." "Perhaps not," Kael said. "But I understand a hunted creature when I see one. Half-bound things are the most dangerous. Finish it." She searched his face for mockery and found none. "Why?" The question came out so quietly it almost vanished in the roar of the pounding doors. Why would the Alpha King who had humiliated her before the entire court now choose this? Kael could have lied, could have called it strategy, necessity, politics. But in the heat and dust and rising terror of that ancient chamber, he found he had no patience left for court lies. "Because I think the wrong people taught you what you are." For one suspended second, the chamber became utterly still. Then, the final bolt broke. The doors burst inward. Priests in moon-white robes flooded the threshold with silver spears and sanctified chains, council guards behind them, fear dressed as righteousness in every face. At their center stood High Counselor Marrow, thin and severe, his voice already raised in command. "By authority of the royal council, the cursed bride is to be put down before sunrise." The sight that met him froze him mid-step. Lyra half transformed in a storm of fire and shadow, the Alpha King standing between her and the weapons, and around them a chamber trembling like the inside of a waking volcano. Marrow recovered quickly, but not enough to hide the hatred in his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said, "step away from the abomination." Kael turned slowly. The look on his face made even seasoned warriors stiffen. "Say that word again," he said, "and I will show you how little your counsel means under my roof." Marrow swallowed, then lifted his chin. Men like him mistook law for courage because they had never needed real courage before. "The southern records were clear," he said. "The girl carries the blood of the ash line." Several priests hissed prayers under their breath. Rowan's grip tightened on his sword. Kael's eyes narrowed. He knew old names. He knew the names kings were taught, never to speak in public, because names held memory. Ash Line was one of them. "Explain," he ordered. Marrow's expression twisted. Before the wolf kingdoms rose, there was another empire in the south. Dragon sovereigns ruled it, and one among them nearly burned the world in answer to betrayal. When the last of their line fell, the surviving pack swore no dragon blood would ever rise beside a wolf crown again. The child born of that line was to be sealed or slain. His gaze slid toward Lyra with disgust. The South chose sealing. We should not repeat their error. Lyra had gone frighteningly quiet. The light around her deepened from gold to molten white. "They slaughtered my bloodline," she said softly. No one answered. She lifted her head and called it balance. The priest advanced a step, silver spearheads leveled. "Do it now," Marrow snapped. "Before she becomes—" He never finished. Kael drew his sword in one fluid motion and placed himself fully between them and Lyra. The sound of steel, clearing its scabbard, cut the chamber like fate. "Anyone who throws another blade," he said, "dies before it lands." Shock rocked the doorway. Even Rowan looked at him anew. This was no longer hesitation, no longer curiosity. This was a choice. Public, dangerous, irreversible choice. The priest faltered, and that was enough. Because in that narrow window between fear and action, Lyra's last restraint broke. The moon-silver dagger slid from her wound by itself, melted into glowing droplets, and vanished against the floor. Lyra screamed, not like a woman, not like a beast, but like something ancient being torn back into existence against the will of everyone who had tried to bury it. Fire erupted around her in a spiraling column, so bright the chamber walls turned white. The force threw priests and guards backward through the ruined doorway. Marrow crashed hard against the corridor stones. Rowan barely held his feet. Cale planted himself and stared straight into the inferno. Inside it, he saw her silhouette stretch and shatter and reform. Wings unfurled wider, fully scaled now, black bronze edged in burning red. Horns curved from her temples like crown points, forged in living flame. Her spine arched, lengthened, remade, under streaming ribbons of molten light. Yet even within that monstrous majesty, part of her remained unmistakably Lyra, the grief, the fury, the soul that had been humiliated in silk and now rose in fire. The chamber ceiling split. Stone rained down in chunks. The mountain answered with a roar from its deepest bones. Fire burst from the cracks in thin lines, racing over the old walls like veins waking after centuries of sleep. The dragon shape within the light dropped to all fours for one thunderous instant, then reared up again, half woman, half sovereign nightmare, a queen dragged from legend and betrayal. Every living being present felt it then. Not mere power, but authority. Ancient, terrible authority. Wolves whimpered. Priests fell to their knees. Even Cale's own beast lowered its head, not in surrender, but in the recognition due an equal from a forgotten age. Lyra opened her eyes fully, and when she did, the firestorm stopped obeying chaos. It began obeying her. The world held its breath, and the rejected bride, whom they had mocked, traded, wounded, and named, cursed all her life, rose from the center of ruin as the dragon queen of the lost ash line. Her voice, when it came, shook the entire keep. No more chains. The words crashed through the vault, like a judgment spoken by the mountain itself. And for several long, stunned heartbeats, no one moved. Fire curled around Lyra's transformed body in slow, terrible ribbons, rising and falling with her breath, as though the chamber itself had become a living furnace bound to her pulse. The broken priests at the doorway remained on their knees, too horrified to advance, and too proud to flee. Counselor Marrow stared up at her with the ashen face of a man who had spent half his life controlling history through sealed records and whispered lies, only to watch the past stand before him in flame and prove it had survived. Rowan still had his sword in hand, but the steel looked pitiful now, absurdly small against the sovereign terror dominating the chamber. Cale alone remained upright at the center of it, sword lowered but not sheathed, his face lit by dragon fire and decision. Lyra's wings shuddered once, shedding sparks. They were not yet the massive wings of the vision Kyle had seen, but neither were they a trick of magic anymore. They were real, scaled, edged, like obsidian and bronze, broad enough to fill the chamber with their shadows. Her torn wedding dress hung in scorched ribbons around a body caught between woman and something older, greater, hungrier. Golden black scales traced her shoulders and spine. A crown of horned ridges curved from her temples through her dark hair. When she drew breath, the flames around her brightened, responding to instinct before thought. Yet beneath that vast and frightening rebirth, Cale still saw the wounded girl who had been offered to wolves as a political sacrifice. He saw it in the tremor at the corner of her mouth, in the way her fingers flexed against the stone as if she were testing a body that no longer entirely belonged to human memory, in the way her gaze, after sweeping over the kneeling priests and the shattered doorway, came back to him with something rawer than fury. She had become power itself, and still the first face she searched for in the chaos was the man who had publicly humiliated her less than an hour ago. Marrow found his voice first, because cowardly men often discovered courage only when hidden behind doctrine. "Kill it," he rasped, shoving himself backward against the corridor wall as if distance could restore authority. Kill it before it leaves this chamber, before the blood oath is broken again. The priests looked to Kale, not Marrow. Even terrified, they knew which command truly ruled Blackthorn Keep. Kale's expression did not change. "She has a name," he said. The quiet force of the words cut deeper than a shout. Marrow's face twisted. "That thing forfeited any name the moment its dragon blood awoke. We sealed that line for a reason." Lyra's head turned toward him with unnerving stillness. Firelight rippled along the scales at her throat. "You sealed children," she said softly. "You hunted mothers. You buried kingdoms and called the ash peace." Marrow opened his mouth to deny it, but something in her eyes strangled the lie before it formed. Some truths were too old and too soaked in blood to survive direct sunlight. The priests shifted uneasily, silver spears wavering. They had entered the vault expecting a demon to cleanse, a cursed bride to execute. Instead, they had found an ancient queen speaking in the language of inheritance and slaughter. And beneath their fear, a more dangerous realization had begun to spread. If Lyra was not a corruption, then the church and the council had built generations of power atop a deliberate falsehood. Men would commit atrocity to preserve kingdoms, but they would commit worse to preserve the stories that justified them. Kale knew it at once. He also knew Marrow knew it. That was why the counselor would not stop. "Your Majesty," Marrow said, forcing steadiness back into his voice. "Step aside. This is no longer a matter of marriage or treaty. This is the return of a bloodline our ancestors swore never to permit. If you protect her, you betray the wolf crown itself." The chamber waited. Kale looked at Lyra. He remembered the moment in the great hall when she had pleaded with him not to touch her, not because she feared pain, but because she feared what her pain would do to others. He remembered the resignation in her eyes when he rejected her publicly. The years of silence that must have taught her humiliation was safer than hope. He remembered, too, the way she had asked why. Why would he help her? Why would he stand between her and chains? That question had carved deeper into him than he wanted to admit. Wolves respected strength. Kings worshipped control. But there was another thing, rarer than either, and infinitely more dangerous once it appeared. Recognition. Recognition of the one person in the room who had been lied about more completely than anyone else. "If the wolf crown demands the slaughter of an innocent to survive," Kyle said at last, "then the crown has been weak for longer than I thought." Rowan inhaled sharply. Marrow's eyes widened in disbelief. The priests recoiled as though struck. Kale lowered his sword point to the stone and spoke with cold, final precision. "No one touches Lyra Vale." The choice rippled outward like thunder. In the corridor beyond the ruined doors, frightened guards exchanged looks of utter confusion. Some stepped back. Others, loyal first to the council and then to fear, tightened their grip on sanctified chains and blessed steel. Marrow saw his chance narrowing and lunged for it. "Then you are blinded," he hissed. "By the mate bond, by sorcery, by whatever old poison she has breathed into your blood." At that word, something electric flashed through the chamber. Mate bond. Kale felt it a half second before he understood it, an invisible line pulling taut beneath his skin, a hot, violent awareness that began low in his chest and spread like wildfire through his veins. His wolf surged forward, not in aggression, but in recognition so sharp it nearly stole the breath from him. Lyra jerked as though struck by the same force. Their eyes locked. For one disorienting instant, the burning vault disappeared, and KL felt only her. Her fear, her exhaustion, her years of forced obedience, her rage so old it had roots, and somewhere beneath all of it a fragile, furious refusal to be broken. The sensation vanished almost as quickly as it came, but not before both of them knew. Lyra stepped back as if the invisible connection had burned her more deeply than her own fire. "No," she whispered, and the word carried more shock than denial. Kale's grip tightened on his sword. He had rejected her in ignorance. Now the truth hit him with merciless clarity. The restlessness in his wolf, the impossible pull at first sight. The instinct to protect her before reason had caught up. It had been there from the beginning, hidden, perhaps, by the seal on her blood, or by the violent old vow she had spoken of. But now the final barrier had fallen. The Alpha King of Wolves had publicly rejected the very woman fate had bound to him, and in doing so had awakened a dragon queen beneath his own roof. For a man who prided himself on control, the irony would have been bitter under any other circumstances. Now it was simply unbearable. Mero saw understanding cross Kale's face and smiled thinly, sensing weakness. There. You feel it now, don't you? That is how she wins. That is how her kind always won. Seduction through power, domination through blood. Mero never finished the sentence. Lyra moved first. She did not lunge. She did not scream. She lifted one hand, and a ring of fire snapped into existence around the councilmen and priests at the doorway, not touching them, but penning them in with a heat so intense they stumbled backward, crying out. The fire rose head high in a perfect circle, controlled to the inch. Kyle's gaze sharpened. This was not frenzy anymore, not merely a transformation gone wild. This was sovereignty. Lyra's voice came low and cold, stripped now of the frailty the court had mistaken for weakness. "Speak of my bloodline again," she said, "and I will show you what your ancestors feared enough to bury." Mero fell silent. No one doubted her. But power came with a price. Kale saw it before anyone else did. The fire ring held, but Lyra swayed. The scales along one side of her neck flickered strangely, appearing and receding as though her new form were still arguing with her body. The transformation had not finished cleanly. It was too much, too soon, forced open by pain and treachery. If she kept burning power at this rate, she would either collapse or lose control entirely. Kale sheathed his sword and took one measured step toward her. Instantly, every eye in the chamber snapped to him. Lyra's gaze sharpened. "Don't," she said, and for the first time since rising in flame, there was uncertainty in her voice, not fear of him, fear of what she might do to him. The distinction mattered. "I'm not here to restrain you," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, and that answer struck him harder than suspicion would have. She did know. Somehow, absurdly, impossibly, she knew. From above them came another distant crash. The keep itself was no longer stable. Blackthorn had been built over older foundations, and whatever dragon line architecture or forgotten wards slept in the mountain did not seem pleased to be waking after centuries of suppression. Rowan glanced upward, then back to Kyle. "Your Majesty, the upper halls are near panic. The nobles are already spreading word that the cursed bride turned into a demon, and the king has lost his reason. Several clan lords are rallying their guards." An almost humorless smile touched Kale's mouth. "Then they're doing what frightened men always do." Rowan nodded grimly. "If they unite with the council, you may be facing open revolt before dawn." Kale's gaze flicked once more to Lyra, to the firelight breathing around her, to the exhaustion hidden beneath the majesty. Political collapse should have been his first concern. Instead, his first thought was that she could not survive another attack in this state. That realization irritated him because it was dangerous, and because it came too naturally. Mero, trapped beyond the ring of fire, seized on Rowan's words. "Listen to your captain," he shouted. "The realm will not accept a dragon queen in Wolflands. The Pax will never bow to her. Kill her now, and you may still contain this." Lyra did not turn toward him. She looked only at Kale, as though his answer had somehow become the axis upon which the room turned. "Would they follow you?" she asked him, "if you chose me?" There was no softness in the question, no hopeful trembling. It was a ruler's question, asked by someone who understood the cost of every alliance and every crown. Kale answered, with the same brutal honesty he had given her in the vault. Some would. Some would pretend to until they found a safer rebellion. Some would rather burn the kingdom than kneel beside what they were taught to fear. Lyra's expression did not shift. "And you?" The fire ring hissed. Dust fell from the cracked ceiling. Kale stepped closer, until he stood only a few paces from her, near enough to feel the heat curling over his skin like living breath. "I already made one choice in ignorance," he said. "I won't make the next one the same way." The words settled between them, heavy and unfinished. Lyra stared at him, and something in her fierce, exhausted face changed. Not forgiveness. He had not earned that. Not yet. But the first fracture in the wall she had built around herself opened there, just enough for possibility to exist. Then pain hit her again. Her wings convulsed outward with a harsh metallic rasp of scales and bone. She dropped to one knee, one hand slamming into the stone floor hard enough to crack it in a spider web. The fire ring around the council wavered. Marrow instantly shouted for the priests to strike. 2 of them raised their silver spears and hurled them through the weakening flames. Kale moved on instinct. He snatched one spear from the air and twisted aside from the second. Lyra saw the weapon streaking toward him and reacted before thought. Flame burst between them, vaporizing the spear to silver steam a handspan from his throat. The effort nearly threw her flat. That was enough. Kale's patience ended with a coldness that terrified everyone who knew him. He turned toward the councilmen and priests, eyes like winter steel. "Rowan." His captain did not hesitate. "Take Marrow and every priest in that doorway. Disarm them. Chain them. If anyone resists, break their legs first and ask questions later." Rowan's answering grin was brief and savage. "Gladly." The fire ring dropped at Lyra's gesture, and royal guards loyal to Kale surged forward. The corridor erupted into shouts, metal, and pain. Marrow protested, invoked law, lineage, holy duty. No one cared. He went down under Rowan's gauntleted fist and was dragged from the floor by the collar, like a scholar who had wandered into a war he did not understand. The priests fared no better. Silver clattered. Sanctified chains were used on the men who had brought them. Justice, Kale had learned long ago, was often most efficient when stripped of ceremony. When the last of the council faction had been hauled from the threshold, the vault fell strangely quiet. Only the crackle of flame and Lyra's unsteady breathing remained. Kale crossed the chamber slowly. He stopped within arm's reach and waited. A lesser man might have reached for her at once, hoping tenderness would mend what violence had broken. Kale understood too well that tenderness offered before trust could feel like another form of taking. Lyra remained kneeling, head bowed, wings partly unfurled behind her in scorched majesty. At length she said, without looking up, "You should hate me." The confession came so quietly that another man might have missed it. Kyle did not. "For destroying my hall?" he asked. "For nearly bringing your kingdom into rebellion?" She finally lifted her face. "For being what I am." The rawness in those 6 words spoke more clearly than tears. She was not asking whether wolves feared dragons. She already knew they did. She was asking whether he, knowing the full truth, would now recoil the way everyone else eventually had. Kale knelt in front of her. The act itself startled her more than any speech could have done. Kings did not kneel, not to broken brides, not to monsters from buried dynasties. Yet there he was, one knee on the cracked stone, bringing himself level to her gaze. "Lyra," he said, and the simple use of her name sounded different now, deliberate and grounded. "I hate what was done to you. I hate the lies wrapped around you until even you half believed them. I hate that I helped those lies in my hall." The admission cost him pride, which meant it cost him more than most men would understand. Her throat worked. "But I do not hate you." Something bright and dangerous flickered across her face, Hope's uglier, more cautious cousin. She looked away first. "You might, when you see all of it." Kale's mouth hardened. "Then let me decide that after I've seen it." A strange silence followed, intimate despite the ruin around them. Above, the fortress still groaned. Somewhere distant, bells rang and shouts echoed through corridors as clan banners shifted, and fear organized itself into politics. But here, in the oldest heart of the mountain, Two beings bound by fate and blood sat amid shattered law and waking fire, and the future of kingdoms narrowed to the distance between one steady breath and the next. Lyra's wings folded inward slightly. The motion was clumsy, painful. She was still learning where her own body ended. Kael noticed the strain at once. "You need rest." She gave him a look so exhausted it was almost amused. "Do dragon queens rest in your kingdom?" "Tonight," he said, rising. "They do if the Alpha King orders it." That earned the ghost of a laugh from her, thin and unbelieving, but real. The sound went through him like heat finding a crack in armor. Rowan returned a few moments later, blood on one sleeve, and satisfaction in every line of him. "Marrow and the priests are secured. Seraphine broke one guard's nose and nearly escaped the East Tower, but she's chained now and threatening to poison half the kingdom through marriage alliances." Kael barely spared her a thought. "Let her threaten." Rowan's gaze slid to Lyra, then back to his king. There was still caution in it, but not fear anymore. Rowan had watched Kael choose. That mattered. "The clan lords are assembling in the upper council chamber. They demand an answer before dawn." Kael nodded once. The answer, of course, would determine whether Blackthorn Keep woke to civil war or submission. He should go immediately. He should crush revolt before it took shape. Yet when he turned toward the stairs, Lyra's hand closed weakly around the edge of his cloak. The touch was light, almost accidental, but it stopped him more effectively than any command. He looked back. She had not meant to grab him, he realized. Her body had reached before her pride caught up. For one brief second, exposed in the aftershock of pain and transformation, she looked very young, not weak, simply tired of facing every horror alone. "Will they come for me again?" she asked. The question was small, but it carried the full weight of a life lived under judgment. Kael bent and drew his cloak from his shoulders. It was heavy black wolf fur lined with iron-threaded leather, warm from his own body. Without flourish, he draped it around her. Against scales and torn bridal silk, the gesture looked almost ceremonial. "Yes," he said, because he had promised honesty. "They will." Her fingers tightened in the fur. "Then why leave?" His gaze held hers. "Because I need to remind them," he said softly, "that if they come for you again, they come through me." The fire in the chamber dimmed, as if listening. Lyra stared up at him in silence, wrapped now in the Alpha King's own cloak. Dragon wings half hidden beneath wolf fur, like two old empires trying not to recognize each other. Kael straightened and turned to Rowan. "Post my personal guard at every passage leading down here. No priest, lord, or councilman enters without losing a hand first. Send for the royal healer, not a church physician, not a council ally. One of ours. Someone who obeys me." Rowan inclined his head. "At once." Kael took 2 steps toward the stairway, then stopped. Without facing her, he said, "Lyra." She looked up. "When I return, I want the truth. All of it. No more priests' versions. No more council records. Yours." A long pause followed. Then came her answer, steady despite everything. "If you return," she said, "I'll give it." Kael almost smiled at that. Almost. "I always return." Then he climbed the steps toward the rebellion gathering above, carrying with him the knowledge that before dawn he would either hold his kingdom together by sheer force of will, or watch it split between wolves of the old world and the dragon queen of the buried one. And below, in the deep chamber beneath Blackthorn Keep, Lyra sat alone for the first time, not as a caged offering or a cursed bride, but as a sovereign awakening into her own name, wrapped in the scent and oath of the man who had rejected her before the court and chosen her before the fire. Neither of them yet understood that the true betrayal had only just begun, because in the East Tower, chained and bloodied and smiling through split lips, Seraphine was not praying for rescue. She was waiting for the traitorous general she had summoned weeks ago. And before the moon set, Blackthorn Keep would burn from within. Above Blackthorn Keep, the night had turned unnaturally bright, not with dawn, not with moonrise, but with fear. The fortress that had stood unconquered through blood wars, famine winters, and rival alpha sieges, now trembled beneath a threat that had not come from beyond its walls, but from the lies coiled deep inside them. Bells rang from tower to tower in frantic iron voices. Clan banners snapped in the wind across the upper battlements as armed retainers flooded courtyards and corridors, every noble house trying to decide, in the span of a few panicked minutes, whether loyalty to the throne would preserve their future or destroy it beside a dragon queen risen from legend. Kale climbed from the lower vaults into that chaos, with ash still clinging to his cloakless shoulders and dragon fire reflecting faintly in his eyes. Men stepped aside when he passed. Some did so out of obedience, others out of pure animal instinct. The Alpha King moved like a storm contained only by flesh, and everyone who saw him knew before he spoke that something irreversible had happened beneath the keep. The upper council chamber was already full when he entered. It was a circular hall carved with the victories of old wolf kings, ringed by elevated seats, where the ruling clan lords of the northern territories now stood in loud, furious knots. The great windows overlooking the inner courtyards had been flung open, and through them came the noise of frightened soldiers, neighing horses, and the far-off crackle of fires, still smoldering in the ruined wedding hall. At the center of the chamber stood the clans that mattered most. Lord Varric of Stonefang, old and brutal, whose loyalty belonged only to strength. Lady Thessa of Frost Hollow, sharp-minded and cold enough to cut alliances into pieces with a single sentence. The twin alphas of Redmaw, young, arrogant, and desperate for any fracture in the crown they could use for profit. And behind them all, whispering from the edges like crows around a corpse, stood the lesser nobles who had mocked Lyra in silk while she knelt in humiliation not long ago. The instant Kyle crossed the threshold, the noise collapsed into tense silence. Good, he thought. Let them fear the truth before they heard it. Lord Varric was first to break the quiet. "We have reports," the old warlord growled, "that the southern bride transformed into a fire beast beneath this keep. We have reports that priests were imprisoned by your order. We have reports that the royal hall is half destroyed, and the council's sanctified guards were disarmed like common criminals. Tell us those reports are false." Kael strode to the center of the chamber and stopped beneath the carved wolf insignia of his line. He did not sit. He did not need the throne behind him to command the room. "The reports are incomplete," he said. That answer alone sent a ripple of unease through the gathered clans. Lady Thessa narrowed her pale eyes. "Then complete them." Kael's gaze swept the chamber once, slow and merciless. "Lyra Vale is not cursed." Murmurs flared immediately. He spoke over them. "She is of the Ash line." This time the chamber erupted. Several lords cursed aloud. One noblewoman stumbled back as though the name itself could stain her. The Redmaw twins began talking over each other in furious disbelief, invoking old prophecies and older battlefield songs. Someone shouted, "Then she should have been killed on sight." Someone else hissed, "The dragon blood survived." Another voice, thin with panic, cried, "The priests warned us this day would come." Kael let them burn themselves empty for several breaths. Then he raised one hand. The room obeyed. "She awoke because the council and their holy pets forced her hand," he said. "They concealed the truth. They brought silver and chains into my fortress. They struck first. And when they failed, they tried to dress their panic in law." Lord Varric's face darkened. "Whatever the council did, it changes nothing. Dragon blood cannot stand beside the wolf crown." Kael's jaw hardened. "And yet it already has." That landed like a blade in the center of the chamber. Lady Thessa saw it before the others did. She stepped forward slightly, frost-colored skirts whispering across stone. "No," she said softly. "You cannot mean." Kael did not spare them gentleness. "She is my mate." The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to suck all air from the hall. Outside, somewhere in the courtyards below, a horse screamed. A bell clanged once. The entire north tilted toward a different future. The Redmaw twins were first to recover, both laughing in disbelief until they realized Kael was not. Their laughter died ugly and fast. Lord Varric's scarred hand closed around the pommel of his sword. Lady Thessa's face became unreadable, which in a woman like her was more dangerous than outrage. Across the chamber, lesser nobles began exchanging terrified looks. A dragon queen as an enemy was one thing. A dragon queen tied to the Alpha King by fate itself was another. Then fate has betrayed the North, Varric snarled. No, Cale said. The North was betrayed long before tonight, by men who buried truth because they feared what they could not control. One of the council-aligned clan lords, a thin man from Winterscar, stepped forward with the desperate courage of the politically cornered. You expect us to bow to a female with dragon blood? To the daughter of a line wolf swore to erase? To a creature that burned half your fortress within moments of awakening? I expect you, Cale said, every word edged in iron, to remember who still commands this kingdom. The Lord went pale, but fear made him reckless. And if the kingdom refuses? Kael's eyes turned to him fully then, and the man stepped back before he meant to. Then, the kingdom will learn the difference between rebellion and suicide. No one spoke after that, because every person in the chamber knew Kael Draven well enough to hear the truth in his tone. He was not bargaining. He was not testing opinion. He was drawing a line so clear that only fools would mistake it. And there were, unfortunately, many fools in noble blood. Lady Thessa folded her arms inside her fur-lined sleeves, studying him with a strategist's patience. If what you say is true, she said, then the threat is no longer only internal. Once word spreads beyond Blackthorn, rival packs, southern factions, and every carrion-minded power from here to the eastern coasts will see weakness. Some will come to kill her, some to claim her, some to use the panic to fracture your borders. Whether we hate her or not is suddenly less important than whether we survive what follows. Finally, someone speaking as if they understood power. Cale inclined his head once. Yes, Lord Varric spat on the floor. Then kill her and end it. Cale's expression did not change. Try, he said. The old warlord's face mottled dark with fury. Half the chamber tensed, expecting steel. But before anyone could choose between argument and blood, the great doors to the council hall burst open. A royal guard stumbled inside, armor blackened, blood running down one side of his face. Your Majesty, he choked, nearly falling to one knee. The East Tower, Lady Seraphine, there's been a breach. Cale's body went still. The guard forced the next words out through ragged breath. The lower eastern gate has been opened from within. General Malrek's banners are inside the outer walls. For the first time that night, true murder entered Kael's eyes. Malrek, traitor, general of the Eastern Legions, the man who had once eaten at Kael's own war table and sworn blood oaths to the crown before vanishing months earlier into the borderlands after being accused, never proven of secret dealings with rebel clans and Dota, southern mercenaries. Seraphine had called him here. Of course she had. Ambitious women and traitorous men were drawn to each other by the same hunger. They would rather watch a kingdom bleed than stand one step below the throne. The hall exploded into chaos again. What have you done? The gates are compromised. Malrek has 5,000 men in the east marches. This is civil war. Kael turned and struck the edge of the council table with one gauntleted fist. The ancient oak cracked down the middle. Silence hit the room like a blow. Enough. No one breathed. Kael looked at every clan lord in turn. This is the hour you choose what you are. Wolves of the crown, or scavengers, who mistake panic for opportunity. Malrek enters my fortress while you argue over bloodlines and old songs. Anyone who cannot tell the difference between a political fear and an active enemy is too stupid to keep a seat in this chamber. Lord Varik Bristlet. Lady Thessa's mouth twitched once, almost approving. Kael pointed toward the doors. Arm your people. Defend the inner walls. Hold the courtyards. Any clan that withdraws now will be marked traitor before sunrise. That was enough to move them. Not loyalty. Not yet. But survival wore a convincing face. The chamber emptied in a storm of boots, shouted orders, and rattling steel. Varric barked commands to Stonefang retainers. The Redmaw twins fled to gather their personal guards. Lady Thessa paused only once beside Cale, her expression cool, analytical, dangerous. "If she flies tonight," she said quietly, "half the kingdom will kneel, and half will break." Cale did not look at her. "Then let them decide and fire." She held his gaze for one hard moment, then inclined her head and left. Within minutes, the council hall stood nearly empty. Only Rowan remained at Cale's side, blood still drying on his sleeve. "She planned it well," Rowan muttered. Seraphine knew awakening Lyra would split the court. Malrek only had to arrive while everyone was still choosing their side. Cale's voice dropped lower, colder. "Then we deny them time." He turned toward the doors. "Seal the inner western gates. Archers on every elevated pass. I want Malrek slowed before he reaches the heart of the keep. And Rowan—" "Yes, my king? Bring me Seraphine alive." Rowan's smile this time had teeth in it. "With pleasure." As the captain vanished into the corridor, Cale moved with brutal speed back toward the hidden stairwells descending into the underkeep. Because while traitors swarmed the fortress above, one truth mattered more than all the others. Lyra was still below, weak from transformation, still learning the shape of her own power. And if Malrek or Seraphine reached her first, Blackthorn would not survive the night. He descended through stone passages filled with running guards, shouted reports, and the metallic scent of fear. Somewhere overhead came the deep horn blasts of the eastern attack. Steel met steel. Men roared. Horses pounded over the lower courtyards. Smoke had begun seeping down through the old cracks in the keep. By the time Cale reached the final chamber, the air below had changed. The dragonfire was calmer now. He entered the vault, to find Lyra standing, not kneeling, not collapsed in exhaustion, standing. His cloak still covered her shoulders, though the wolf fur now draped strangely around the half-hidden ridges of her wings. The full blaze of her transformation had eased, but not vanished. Her scales remained visible in elegant, dangerous patterns along her throat, collarbones, forearms, and spine. Her eyes, though less incandescent, still carried that deep ember red beneath human shape. She looked less like a wounded girl, and more like what she truly was becoming. A queen who had spent years forced to crouch inside a smaller name. At the sound of his steps, she turned, and in that instant, the bond between them struck harder than before. Perhaps because they were both blooded now, he by battle, she by awakening. Perhaps because fate, once unsealed, did not enjoy half measures. Cale felt the echo of her across his body like a second heartbeat. Her exhaustion, yes, but also her sharpened clarity, her rising anger, the ancient instinct in her blood orienting itself to threat above. Lyra felt him too. He saw it in the slight widening of her gaze. The black violence of his resolve, the pressure of command, the fury he held leashed so tightly it could pass for calm. "The gates," she said before he spoke. He stopped a few paces from her. "You felt it." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "I feel the whole mountain now." Another tremor moved faintly beneath the floor. Above them, somewhere distant but growing nearer, came the roar of men in combat. "Malrek is inside the outer walls," Kyle said. Seraphine opened the east gate. Lyra's expression went very still, not surprised. That bothered him. "You knew she would do something," he said. "I knew she hated me enough to invite war if it meant watching me drown in it." Lyra looked away briefly, as if listening to the stones. "When I was brought to the north, Seraphine sent women to my chambers under the pretense of helping me dress for court. They asked strange questions about my blood, my dreams, whether fire had ever followed my moods. I thought it was cruelty." Her jaw tightened. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe someone was feeding answers to her. Kyle's mind moved instantly. Malrek, or someone above him. The council, he thought. Perhaps not all, but enough. Enough to let Seraphine play with old monsters because they believed they could direct the outcome. Fools. All of them. The chamber shook harder this time. Dust sifted from the ceiling in pale streams. Kael stepped closer. "Can you fight?" The question should have been impossible. Cruel, even. She had awakened into dragonfire less than an hour ago. But Lyra did not flinch from it. She looked him in the eye and answered like a sovereign. Yes. Then, after a small pause that carried all the honesty he had asked of her, for a while, that was enough. Kael nodded once. "Then we hold until dawn." Lyra's gaze flickered past him, upward, through stone beyond it. He could almost see the old power aligning behind her eyes, measuring walls, height, heat, distances, lines of attack. "No," she said softly. "You hold. I burn." He stared at her. She turned fully toward him, and for a moment, despite the torn gown and exhaustion and smoke filtering into the chamber, she looked exactly like the figure he had seen in the vault's first vision, not merely dangerous, but destined to be remembered. "If Malrek's soldiers reach the inner courtyards," she said, "your clans will split the moment they see uncertainty. But if they see me, really see me, there will be no uncertainty left. Fear will choose for them." Kael understood the strategy immediately. It was ruthless, effective, and dangerous beyond reason. "You are not stable enough to take the skies," he said, her mouth curved faintly, without warmth. "Neither is your kingdom." Above them, another crash resounded louder, closer. A messenger's horn screamed from somewhere in the mid-level corridors. The east towers were falling back. Lyra spread her wings slightly, even half-controlled. The sight of them sent a pulse through the bond between them so fierce it bordered on pain. Power, awe, hunger. A terrible, fierce beauty his wolf did not fear so much as recognize. "If I remain hidden below while your men die above," she said, "then everything they called me becomes true. Weapon, curse, thing to be chained underground until convenient." Her eyes held his with raw intensity. "I have lived inside other people's fear long enough." Something in Kael yielded then, not submission. Never that, but recognition of an equal choosing her own war. He stepped into her space until only a breath remained between them. The chamber's heat closed around them. "If you fly," he said quietly, "they will see you as queen or enemy, nothing in between." Lyra's lashes lowered once, slow and heavy with too many unslept years. "There has never been anything in between for me." The truth of that landed like a wound. Kael lifted one hand. Not to command, not to restrain, to touch. He stopped just beside her jaw, giving her the moment to refuse. She did not move away. Very slowly, he brushed his knuckles against the scaled line of her cheek. Her breath caught. The contact was brief, almost reverent, and yet it sent a violent pulse through the bond. An electric current of fire and instinct, and something far more dangerous because it was not born of battle. Promise. Lyra closed her eyes for one heartbeat. When she opened them again, they were brighter. "I rejected you before the court," Kael said, his voice rougher now, stripped of kingly distance. "I will not hide you before the kingdom." For the first time since the wedding hall, genuine emotion cracked through her composure in full. Not softness, not relief. Something more painful than either. The shock of being chosen where she had expected concealment. He let his hand fall. Then, he gave her what only a ruler could give another ruler beneath his power. A public place. "Come," he said. They rose together through the fortress like the answer to an old prophecy no one had wanted fulfilled. By the time they reached the upper battlements, Blackthorn Keep had become a battlefield. Malrek's men had stormed the eastern lower courtyards, beneath banners of dark iron and split wolf insignias, painted over with ash-gray stripes. Archers traded volleys from tower bridges. Oil burned in trenches below. Stonefang warriors fought pack to pack at the inner gatehouse, while Frost Hollow retainers held the north wall stairs with spear formations tight as ice. The sky above the fortress glowed red with reflected fire and drifting sparks. Everywhere, men shouted, bled, and chose sides in real time. Then the rooftop doors exploded open. Kael stepped out first onto the high eastern rampart, black hair wind-whipped, sword in hand, looking less like a king than the violence that founded kingships. And behind him came Lyra. For one suspended second, the entire battlement seemed to freeze. Archers lowered bows mid-draw. Wounded men turned. Clan lords on adjacent walls stopped shouting commands. Below, even Malrek's advancing soldiers hesitated as the moonlight struck her. She wore no crown. She did not need one. Kael's black wolf cloak streamed from her shoulders over the torn remnants of her bridal gown. Her wings unfurled wider now in the open air, their dark bronze scales catching both moonlight and firelight in living bands of shadowed gold. Embers drifted from the edges like stars burning off a horizon. The patterns of ancient flame still traced her skin, not as uncontrolled eruption anymore, but as royal script written across flesh. Her eyes glowed with the deep red of furnace hearts, and when she lifted her chin, something in the old blood of everyone watching remembered. Not story, not myth, memory. A dragon queen. A murmur ran through the battlefield, like wind through dry grass. Then Malrek himself rode into view through the shattered east approach below. He wore black iron plate and a crimson commander's cloak, his face scarred and handsome in the cruel way of men who trusted violence because it had never yet failed them. Around him rode chosen captains and mercenary banners, all slowing now under the sight above. Malrek removed his helm, looked up at the battlement, and smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed chaos could still be bent to his use. "So?" he called over the burning courtyard, his voice carrying through war with practiced ease. The stories were true. Kyle's grip tightened on his sword. Malrek's gaze shifted from him to Lyra, lingering with a calculation so cold it made Kael want to tear his throat out with his teeth. "You should have come to me, not the wolves," Malrek said to her. "I would have known your value." Lyra's expression did not change. "I am not a coin," she replied. The sound of her voice crossing the battlefield sent another hush through the men below. Malrek laughed. "No," he said. "You're a throne." There it was. Ambition without disguise. He had not come to kill her. He had come to claim her, use her, crown himself beside her if he could, put chains on her if he could not. Kael stepped forward to the edge of the battlement. "You opened war under my roof." Malrek's smile thinned. "Your roof cracked the moment you let prophecy breathe." Below and around them, every soldier listened. This was no longer only battle. It was theater of power. A kingdom, deciding, in public, who would define its future. Kael raised his voice, not to Malrek, but to every wolf on every wall. "Look well," he commanded. The traitor who opened these gates did so, not for crown, not for pack, not for the north, but for himself. He would burn your homes and blame old blood for the smoke. Then he turned and did the one thing no one on those battlements expected. He reached for Lyra's hand. The gesture was simple, unmistakable, public. The whole fortress saw it. The Alpha King of the North took the hand of the woman he had rejected before the court and held it beside him in the open sight of clans, enemies, nobles, mercenaries, and fate itself. A shockwave of murmurs rolled across the walls. Kael's voice rang out over all of them. "This is Lyra Vale of the Ashline," he declared. "She stands under my protection, beside my crown, and before dawn any hand raised against her will be judged the same as a hand raised against me." The battlements went dead silent. Then everything changed. Some wolves dropped to one knee immediately, whether from fear, instinct, or the ancient pull of strength recognizing greater strength, no one could say. Others remained standing, pale-faced and rigid, but they did not move against her. Lady Thessa, from the western stair tower, lowered her spear and bowed her head the smallest degree. Lord Varric did not kneel, but he roared for Stone Fang to hold the wall, which in a man like him was as close to acceptance as the world was likely to get tonight. And below, in the burning eastern yard, Malrek's smile vanished, because he understood at once what Kael had done. He had denied ambiguity, denied rumor, denied hesitation. He had bound Lyra to the visible center of the wolf throne before the whole kingdom could fragment around uncertainty. It was brilliant, infuriating. And now Malrek had only one path left. Blood. Archers. Malrek bellowed. The command had barely left his mouth when Lyra moved. She stepped forward from Kael's side, wings spreading to their full midnight breadth over the battlement. The wind changed. Fire from the lower trenches bent upward toward her as if answering a sovereign call. Men below looked up just in time to see her inhale. The battlefield held its breath with her. Then Lyra Vale, cursed bride no longer, opened her mouth and poured dragon fire into the night. It came not as a wild explosion, but as a devastating river of white gold flame that tore down across the eastern assault line with the wrath of a forgotten dynasty. Siege ladders vanished in seconds. Shields glowed, melted, and ran like water. Horses shrieked and scattered. Men threw themselves flat against stone as fire ripped through the center of Malrek's advance and carved a burning trench between his forces and Blackthorn's inner wall. Heat blasted upward hard enough to whip every banner on the battlements backward. The fortress erupted. Wolves roared. Archers shouted. Stone-fang warriors slammed spears against shields in savage exhilaration. Fear flipped. Not gone. Never gone. But redirected. Now, it belonged to the attackers. Malrek barely escaped the first wash of fire, hauling his rearing horse sideways with skill born of too many campaigns. His outer ranks shattered instantly. Men scattered from the trench she had burned through their formation. Even seasoned mercenaries broke, when legend became visible enough to blister skin. Lyra's fire ceased. She swayed. Only once. But Kael felt it through the bond, like a blade sliding under armor. Too much. She could do that again. Perhaps. Perhaps not. He stepped closer behind her, one hand hovering at her waist without touching, unless she needed it. She knew he was there. He knew she knew. On the battlefield below, Malrek regrouped faster than lesser men would have. Good generals were most dangerous precisely when their plans broke. They had more selves to become. "Kill the king," Malrek roared. "Bring me the dragon alive." Arrows rose in black waves. Kael grabbed Lyra and dragged her down as the first volley struck the battlements. Frost-hollow shields went up. Stone shattered. Men cried out. Lyra twisted from his grip before the second volley landed, fury flashing bright in her eyes. "Alive?" she repeated, disgust and rage sharpening the word. Then she jumped, not fell, jumped, from the high eastern battlement into the war-lit night. Gasps tore across every wall. Kael lunged to the edge in time to see her wings snap wide. For one breathtaking second she dropped through smoke and sparks like a fallen star. Then the dragon blood found the sky it had waited centuries for, and she rose. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but magnificently. Her wings beat once, twice, scattering embers in vast burning arcs as she climbed above the courtyard, above the towers, above the screaming attack lines. Firelight and moonlight wrapped around her transformed shape until she seemed forged from both ruin and memory. Every man below wolf, mercenary, noble, traitor looked up, and in that moment, the kingdom did not see a cursed bride. It saw power older than fear. Kael's entire body locked on the sight. His wolf surged so hard against his skin it hurt. Not to possess, to answer, to stand beside. Below, Malrek shouted new orders, trying to cover panic with strategy. Ballista crews wheeled heavy anti-siege engines into place from the lower east line crude, brutal machines built to punch through gates and large beasts alike. Seraphine, he realized with a cold flash, had not only opened the gates, she had prepared for this. Prepared for wings. "Ballistae," Rowan shouted from the lower tower stair. "They've got two on the east trench." Kael did not think. He moved. He tore down the steps with half his guard behind him, sword already drawn, descending into the interior defense lanes that led toward the eastern yard. Above, Lyra banked once across the smoke-filled night, drawing every eye. Good, he thought grimly. Let them look at the sky. He would kill the men aiming for it. The lower inner gate passage had become slaughter by the time he reached it. Malrek's forward units had forced halfway through the broken outer lane, only to be trapped between dragonfire above and Stonefang axes ahead. Kyle entered that bloodstorm like a verdict. The first mercenary never even saw him. Kyle opened his throat in passing. The second lost a hand, then a head. Rowan and the Royal Guard hit the flank beside him, wolves in iron and rage. The eastern passageway became red ruin, but Kyle's eyes kept lifting to the battlement's edge, to the sky beyond. Lyra wheeled above the fortress once more. Unstable but devastating, every beat of her wings shedding sparks like torn constellations. Then he saw the ballista crews drawing line. No. The nearest machine angled upward, massive iron-tipped bolt loading into place, winches cranking, crew shouting distance and wind. The second adjusted to intersect her next turn above the burning trench. Kyle roared Rowan's name and cut toward them with murder in every stride. Too far. Even he knew it. Too far to reach before they fired. Above, Lyra turned. Perhaps she sensed it through the mountain. Perhaps through the bond. Perhaps because Queen survived by feeling danger before arrows darkened into shape. Her head snapped toward the east trench at the exact instant the first ballista loosed. The bolt tore upward through flame-lit air. Enormous, spinning, lethal. Time narrowed. Kale felt the impossible need to be in two places at once, on the ground killing the men who had launched it, and in the sky between Steel and the woman carrying half his fate. Lyra twisted. The bolt missed her heart by less than a body's width and slammed through the lower span of her left wing. Her scream ripped across Blackthorn. Keep like the end of the world. She dropped. The whole battlefield cried out with her wolves, traitors, everyone, because some sounds reached deeper than sides and banners. Kyle saw fire burst wildly around her as pain shredded control. He saw her body falter in the air and begin to fall toward the shattered eastern courtyard below, and something inside him snapped cleanly in two. He cut down the first ballista crewman with such force the man's body spun. Rowan hit the second. Kale vaulted the wreck of the siege engine, landed in blood and mud, and sprinted toward where Lyra was falling, while above him the Dragon Queen of the Ash Line dropped through smoke and moonlight, with one burning wing torn open. She hit the lower courtyard in an explosion of broken stone, sparks, and fire. Blackthorn shook. Kyle reached her first, and as the smoke rose around them, Malrek's soldiers began closing in. Stone dust and embers rolled through the lower eastern courtyard in a choking storm, swallowing the place where Lyra had struck the earth. For a heartbeat, perhaps two, no one could see anything clearly. Only shattered paving stones, walls lit hell-red by fire, and a crater torn into the inner yard, as if the fortress itself had taken a wound. Then the smoke shifted, and Kale saw her. She was alive. The knowledge hit him so hard it felt like pain. Lyra lay half-buried in broken stone at the center of the crater, one wing twisted beneath her, the other shuddering violently with every ragged breath. Dragonfire still pulsed along her scales in erratic bursts, illuminating the blood running dark from the torn membrane where the ballista bolt had punched through. Her wedding gown, already ruined, was now blackened into ribbons. One horned ridge along her temple had cracked. Her claws were dug so deep into stone that the marble around them had split open like bark beneath lightning. She was alive, but only barely. Kale reached her a heartbeat before the first wave of Malrek's soldiers surged toward the crater. He dropped to one knee in the smoke beside her. Lyra. Her name came out rougher than he intended. One ember-red eye opened. It found him through pain, through ash, through the collapsing edges of consciousness. For an instant, the bond flared so hard between them that he nearly stopped breathing. Agony, fury, shame at falling, terror not of death, but of becoming helpless in front of enemies again. Beneath all of it, something else. Relief. Brutal, unwilling, undeniable relief that the first face she saw in the smoke was his. "Still here?" she whispered, and there was blood at the corner of her mouth. Kale's hand went to the side of her face before he could think better of it. "I told you," he said. "I return." The answering flicker in her eye might have been laughter in another world. It had no time to become anything. "Protect the queen," someone shouted from the wall above, and the words seemed to rip the battlefield open wider. Wolves loyal to the crown began pouring toward the eastern yard from the gate passages. Others hesitated, still stunned by the sight of Lyra broken in the crater. Malrek's mercenaries did not hesitate at all. They saw what wounded predators always drew from lesser creatures: a chance. Kael rose in one fluid motion and turned from Lyra to the advancing line. There are moments in war when command becomes something more primitive than strategy. Not because intelligence fails, but because rage reaches a clarity the mind cannot fake. Kael felt that clarity now. It stripped him to the thing beneath crown and armor and lineage. There was a wounded queen behind him, enemies in front of him. The rest was noise. The first mercenary reached the crater's edge with a hooked blade and the intention to finish what the ballista had begun. Kael met him there and split him from collar to chest so brutally the man's body toppled backward into two different pools of blood. The second attacker lost his jaw. The third had just enough time to recognize who stood in front of him before Kael drove a sword through his throat and kicked him off the steel. Around the crater, the eastern yard became a ring of slaughter. Smoke and sparks whirled through the clash of bodies. Rowan crashed into the left flank with the royal guard, carving a path toward his king. Stone-fang warriors followed with battle axes raised, roaring pack oaths that shook the walls. Above them, Frost Hollow archers changed their angle and began dropping arrows into Malrek's rear line. Still, the mercenaries came, because Malrek had trained them well, because he knew a wounded dragon queen was worth a kingdom, because ambition, when it smells a throne, becomes very hard to frighten. Kael killed 5 more men before he even looked up. When he did, he saw Malrek advancing through the chaos on foot now, his horse gone, helm discarded, great black blade in his hand. The traitor general moved through battle with terrible competence, cutting down anyone who slowed him, eyes fixed on the crater and the woman within it like a hunter, who finally sees the legendary beast bleeding in his sights. Around him were his chosen captains, the men who had followed him not because they loved him, but because they believed he would win. He stopped 10 paces from the crater and smiled. "Would you look at that?" Malrek called over the clash of steel, the mighty Alpha King guarding his fallen miracle. Kael stepped up onto broken stone until he stood above the crater's rim, blood running from a cut at his brow, sword dark to the hilt. "Come closer," he said. "You've talked enough from a distance." Malrek laughed softly. "You know what I admire most about you, Kael. Even now, you think this is about courage." He shifted his grip on the blade. "It never was. It's about timing, about knowing when old powers are weak enough to claim, when kingdoms are frightened enough to kneel to the man who promises order." His gaze slid past Kael to Lyra, and the cold hunger in it made the whole yard feel filthier. "She could have remade the world beside me." Kael's expression became so still that Rowan, even in battle, felt a chill slide down his spine. "She will never stand beside a man like you," Kael said. Malrek's mouth curved. "That depends which one of us survives the next minute." Then he attacked. He was fast, faster than most men gave him credit for, because large warriors were always assumed to be slow by people who had never seen real killers work. His first strike came low, brutal, meant to take Kael's leg and end the fight with efficiency rather than spectacle. Kael met it cleanly, steel ringing hard enough to jar both arms. The second blow came from the opposite angle, then the third overhead. Malrek fought like a man who had spent his life turning battlefields into equations. No wasted motion, no heroic flair, just pressure, force, and the confidence that eventually all bodies failed. Kael gave him none of that. He fought like winter itself. Every parry was punishment, every step forward a threat. He did not give ground so much as choose where blood would fall. Around them, the eastern yard continued tearing itself apart, but the men nearest the crater had begun to draw back despite themselves, not out of courtesy. Instinct. Two apex predators had met in open view, and everyone with any sense knew not to stand between them. Malrek drove Kael back half a pace with a vicious shoulder check and slashed for the throat. Kael turned the blade aside at the last instant, stepped inside the general's guard, and slammed his forehead into Malrek's face with a crack that broke cartilage. Blood burst from the traitor's nose. Malrek staggered, snarled, and recovered fast enough to avoid the killing stroke by inches. Their swords met again, sparks leaping between them. The clangor echoed against stone walls already blackened by dragonfire. Below them, in the crater, Lyra forced herself onto one elbow. Pain exploded through her torn wings so fiercely her vision went white at the edges. The world returned in fragments. The taste of blood, the smell of scorched iron. Kael above her fighting like wrath given human form, and beyond him the battlefield she had set on fire, now threatening to swallow him whole. Rage kept her conscious more than strength did. Rage at Malrek's gaze. Rage at falling. Rage at the old humiliating helplessness trying to wrap itself around her injured body, like it had every time priests held her down and called their cruelty mercy. No, not again. She tried to rise and almost blacked out. The left wing would not answer. Something deep in the joint had torn. Dragonfire pulsed through the wound, trying to seal what human flesh would have simply surrendered to. It was working, but too slowly. Not enough for flight. Not enough for another full inferno. The bond with Kael burned hot and violent under her ribs, and through it she felt his concentration narrowed to a blade point. He was winning. Or would. But not quickly enough. Malrek's captains were already circling for openings. Men with pikes were edging closer, hoping to strike at Kael's back while his attention stayed fixed on their commander. Lyra's jaw clenched. If she could not fly, she could still burn. She pressed one bloodied palm against the crater stone and reached not upward toward fire, but downward, into the mountain. The reaction was immediate. All across the broken eastern yard, every torch, brazier, oil trench, and smoldering beam shuddered. Flames bent toward the crater, as if the fortress itself had inhaled. Warriors on both sides faltered. Some shouted in fear. Others looked around wildly for the next attack from the sky. It was not coming from the sky. It was coming from below. Malrek felt the change first as heat under his boots. He broke from Kael long enough to glance down, and that glance cost him. Kael's sword carved a deep line across his ribs, biting through black iron and flesh beneath. Malrek hissed and spun away, blood darkening his side. Before he could recover, the shattered ground around the crater lit in branching seams of molten gold. Fire raced through the cracks Lyra's fall had opened, turning the courtyard into a web of living ember lines. Then the stone burst. Not in one great explosion. In jagged upward spears of flame and broken rock, hurling Malrek's nearest captains backward and splitting his formation in half. Men screamed. Shields flew from hands. The eastern yard became chaos all over again, as the very floor betrayed the invaders. At the center of it, Lyra rose to one knee in the crater, blood in her hair, dragon wing dragging, eyes incandescent with ancient fury. She lifted her hand, and every burning trench in the courtyard answered. Flame ran like hunted wolves, darting through the cracks and coiling around Malrek's men in walls that drove them apart from one another, not consuming them all at once. Her control was too ragged for that, but isolating them, hurting them, turning trained soldiers into frightened animals. Kael saw it and understood instantly. She was not simply attacking, she was shaping the battlefield. A queen's instinct, he thought savagely. Even half-broken, even bleeding, she was turning war into territory. Malrek knew it too. And for the first time that night, real anger replaced calculation on his face. "Bring me the girl," he roared. "Now!" 3 pikemen lunged for the crater at once. They never reached it. Kael intercepted the first, broke his neck with one hand, and drove his sword through the second, so hard the point punched out between the man's shoulder blades. Rowan took the third in the throat. Stone Fang warriors crashed into the gap behind them, howling. Crown-loyal wolves surged forward under the shelter of Lyra's burning barriers. The tide turned visibly. Mercenaries who had entered Blackthorn expecting frightened nobles now found themselves trapped between wolf packs, rallying to their king and the wounded dragon queen, remaking the earth under their feet. But the worst threat had not yet shown itself. Lyra felt it before she saw it. A familiar venom moving through the smoke. Seraphine. The noblewoman emerged from the ruined side passage above the eastern yard like a ghost dredged from spite itself. Somehow she had slipped her chains or someone had cut them for her. Her hair was loose now, dress torn at the hem, cheeks streaked with blood where glass had marked her. But her posture remained elegant in the way only truly hateful people managed while cities burned around them. In one hand, she carried a crossbow of black horn. In the other, a short ceremonial knife. Not for battle, for finishing. She had not come to save Malrek. She had come for Lyra. Kael saw her at the same instant and bellowed Rowan's name. But Seraphine was already moving along the collapsed upper wall, finding the angle only obsession could make a woman seek in battle. Her eyes locked on the crater below, not on Kael, not on the general, not on the war, on Lyra. The hated bride. The living answer to every ambition Seraphine had built her life upon. "You ruined everything," Seraphine screamed, voice breaking across the battlefield. Lyra looked up. For a strange, detached instant, she saw not the enemy in front of her, but the pattern beneath the woman. Seraphine had never merely wanted Kael. She had wanted certainty. The throne. The order of a future in which her beauty and her lineage and her careful cruelty would be rewarded exactly as she believed they should be. Lyra's existence had shattered that fantasy simply by surviving, and now Lyra's awakening had burned the remains. Seraphine raised the crossbow. Kael moved. Malrek moved too, because one truth united every kind of predator in that heartbeat. If Seraphine struck true, the entire shape of the war would change. The bolt flew. Lyra twisted, but exhaustion slowed her. The quarrel would have taken her through the throat. Instead, Kael stepped into its path. The impact slammed into him just below the shoulder, the force of it half-turning his body. For one heartbeat he did not seem to understand he had been hit. Then blood spread dark and immediate across his armor. The bond between him and Lyra detonated into pure white pain. Her scream this time was more terrible than when the ballista had taken her wing. Everything in the courtyard stopped. Not because a king had been wounded. Kings bled all the time. Because something ancient inside Lyra recognized sacrifice and answered it with a violence older than kingdoms. Kael dropped to one knee, teeth bared, one hand ripping the quarrel from his flesh before it could sink deeper. Poison. He smelled it instantly in the metallic bitterness rising under the blood. Seraphine had not gambled on steel. She had planned for certainty. Rowan roared and charged for the collapsed wall where she stood. Seraphine backed away, horror and triumph warring on her face. Malrek saw the opening he had been waiting for. He lunged for Kael. Lyra did not think. She became. Fire blasted outward from the crater in a ring so vast and sudden it threw every warrior near it off their feet. The eastern yard vanished inside a dome of incandescent gold-white flame. Shields melted. Stone ran liquid at the edges. Malrek was hurled backward across the courtyard and hit the far wall hard enough to crater the masonry. Kael would have been engulfed too, except that the fire curved around him. Even in rage, even in pain, it did not touch him. When the blaze dimmed enough for sight to return, Lyra was standing, fully standing. Blood still ran from her wing. Her body still trembled from strain, but the half measures had burned away. The queen in the crater was no longer suspended awkwardly between girl and beast. She had found a third shape, the sovereign center between them. Tall, scaled, crowned in horn and fire, with wounded wings spread like banners torn in holy war. The broken wedding dress and Kael's wolf cloak streamed around her in heat wind. Her eyes were no longer merely red. They burned white at the core. Every living soul in the eastern yard recoiled. Lyra's voice came low, terrible, resonant enough to shake ash from the walls. "You poisoned the hand that shielded me," she said, looking up at Seraphine. The noblewoman stumbled backward. "You chain children," Lyra said, turning toward the priest still visible on the upper parapets, watching in horrified silence. No one answered. "You call slaughter balance. You call burial peace. You call fear law." She took one step from the crater. The ground beneath her scorched black. Then she looked at Malrek, who was forcing himself upright through smoke and falling debris, blood pouring from his side, hatred now stripped of all elegance. "And you," she said, "mistook me for a throne." Malrek spat blood and laughed a jagged, furious sound. "What else are you?" Lyra's expression changed then, and for the first time since her awakening, something almost sad passed through it. Not sadness for him, for the world that kept making men like him and calling them inevitable. "I am what remains," she said, "when the ash remembers its name." The words did something, not magical in the theatrical sense, not a spell cast with gestures, something older. The old runes along the walls of Blackthorn Keep dormant, buried under centuries of wolf rule, flared to life. Across towers and gate arches and deep foundation stones, ancient symbols long mistaken for decorative scars began glowing molten gold. The fortress had been built over dragon bones after all, Kyle realized through pain and poison haze, or dragoncraft, or some packed wolves had profited from and then erased. Blackthorn was answering her blood. The implications hit like another wound. The fortress itself had memory, and it knew her. Malrek saw the glowing runes too. For the first time, true fear entered his face. He hurled himself toward Kale anyway, because some men, when cornered by destiny, choose stupidity as their final form. Kyle met him halfway. The poison was moving fast, numbing his left arm, blurring the edges of sight. But rage and will held the rest of him together. Their swords crashed once, twice, 3 times. Malrek fought with desperation now, strength turning reckless. Kyle gave him nothing. Not an opening, not a mercy. On the 4th strike, he trapped Malrek's blade, twisted sharply, and drove his knee into the traitor's abdomen hard enough to break posture. Malrek bent. Kale seized his collar, slammed him face first into the scorched stone, and put his sword point to the base of the man's neck. It should have ended there. But Seraphine, driven beyond all reason, raised the ceremonial knife and lunged from the collapsed wall toward Lyra. Rowan reached her a fraction too late to stop the leap. The knife flashed downward. Lyra caught Seraphine by the throat in midair, one-handed. The entire battlefield froze. Seraphine's feet kicked helplessly above the blackened stone. Her beautiful face turned red, then purple, hands clawing at the scaled grip crushing her airway. Up close, all her elegance dissolved. She looked suddenly what she had always been underneath jewels and silk. Not a queen in waiting, but a frightened, cruel woman who had mistaken proximity to power for ownership of it. Lyra stared at her. "You wanted to watch me kneel forever," she said quietly. Seraphine made a choking sound. Lyra's grip tightened. "And yet here you are." Kyle lifted his gaze from Malrek just in time to see the end approaching. He knew what killing Seraphine would do. On one level, nothing would matter less. The woman deserved worse than death. But in the political ruin already spreading across the keep, her public execution by dragonfire would become a banner for every lord still searching for justification to turn fear into holy war. Lyra might survive tonight only to inherit 1,000 sharpened lies by morning. He spoke through blood and poison and effort. Lyra, just her name, nothing more. The effect on her was immediate. Her eyes flicked to him, white fire dimming by a breath. Through the bond she felt it all at once, his pain, the poison in him, the cold calculation still working under his rage, and the deeper truth beneath it. He was not asking mercy for Seraphine. He was asking protection for Lyra's future. That nearly broke her. Because after everything the wolves had done, after the rejection, the chains, the lies, the attack, he was still thinking first of what would keep her from becoming the monster they wanted. Slowly, so slowly, The whole courtyard seemed to move with her. Lyra lowered Seraphine until the woman's feet touched stone. Then she released her. Seraphine collapsed, choking, weeping, hands at her throat. The sight horrified everyone more than if Lyra had killed her. Because restraint in power was always more frightening than frenzy. It suggested rule. Lyra looked down at the gasping noblewoman. "Live," she said, "and remember exactly who spared you." Seraphine curled inward, unable even to answer. Kale exhaled once. Barely. The poison surged. His vision lurched sideways. Lyra felt it instantly, and turned just in time to see him sway over Malrek's pinned body. Fear ripped through her so sharply it nearly stole her shape from her again. She crossed the yard in 3 strides that would have been impossible for any human form, and caught him before he could fall fully. Kale's blood was everywhere now. Not mortal. Not yet. But the poison running through him was wrong, thin, silver dark, carrying the same sanctified bite as priest-made bindings, crafted to weaken shifters, to rot the bond between body and beast. Seraphine had not meant merely to wound him. She had meant to leave the Alpha King alive long enough to be seen falling apart. Lyra lowered him carefully to one knee, while Rowan finished binding Malrek in chains nearby. Around them, the battle had changed shape. Without Malrek's momentum, without Seraphine's spectacle, with Blackthorn's runes awakened and dragonfire still breathing over the yard, the invaders were breaking. Some fled for the eastern gate, others threw down weapons. Crown-loyal wolves drove them back through smoke and ruin with merciless force. None of it mattered to Lyra in that moment. Only him. Kale's skin had gone colder under the heat of the yard. His jaw was set hard enough to crack teeth. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered, voice roughened by pain. "I'm not dead." She nearly laughed and nearly cried and nearly burned the whole fortress down again, all at once. "You're bleeding into my hands," she said, and the words came out breaking at the edges. His gaze lifted to hers. There was so much in it now that had not been there in the wedding hall. No distance, no dismissal, no careless kingly certainty, only a man wounded before her, still fierce, still impossible, and somehow more dangerous for the tenderness he was trying badly to hide. "I've bled before," he said. "Not into me." The words silenced them both. Around them, the eastern yard roared with the final sounds of battle being finished. Rowan barked for healers. Stonefang called victory from the inner wall. Somewhere above, bells began changing rhythm from alarm to hold fast. Blackthorn Keep had not fallen, but the night was far from over. Lyra pressed one hand over Kale's wound. Dragonfire was not healing, not as wolves understood healing. It was transformation, purification, force. To use it on a poisoned body without care might burn more than it saved. But she felt the sanctified venom through his blood, and understood, instinctively now, what it wanted to do. Separate him from his wolf. Rot the line between man and beast, until both failed. Ancient rage rose in her again. No, not him. Not after this. She looked toward the glowing runes alive across the eastern wall, then back to Kale. Somewhere in old memory, not wholly her own, a truth surfaced. The poison is priest. Forged, she said quietly. Silver sanctified in moon, water and oath, ash. Kale, even half fading, gave a grim little nod. That sounds like something our holy men would invent when ordinary murder feels too honest. Lyra swallowed hard. I can burn it out. His eyes sharpened despite the haze. You can, what? I can burn it out, she repeated. But it won't be gentle. And if I'm wrong, she did not finish. He understood anyway. If she was wrong, she would either stop his heart or damage the wolf bond at the center of his life. Kale looked at the hand pressing blood and heat into his wound. Then he looked up at her face. Around them the yard blurred into irrelevance. You're not wrong, he said. The certainty in his voice terrified her more than doubt would have. Kale, do it. She froze. He lifted his uninjured hand slowly now, pain making every inch harder, and touched the side of her wrist where her pulse burned beneath scale and skin. "I chose you in fire," he said, voice low enough that only the bond and the night itself seemed to hear it. "I'm not taking that choice back in pain." Something inside Lyra split open. Not the old seal. Something far more dangerous. Trust. Raw. Unwanted. Immense. She bent over him, closing her eyes once against the storm inside her. Then she opened them, white fire steadying at the center. Carefully, reverently, she placed both hands over the wound in his shoulder and the poisoned veins branching from it. The eastern yard fell silent as wolves and surviving enemies alike turned to watch. The Dragon Queen bowed over the wounded Alpha King, and fire began to gather in her palms. Fire gathered first as light. Not flame, not heat. Light. It pooled beneath Lyra's palms in molten gold-white veins, seeping between her fingers where they pressed over Kael's wound, and the entire ruined eastern yard seemed to lean toward it in breathless silence. Wolves stopped mid-stride. Healers halted where they stood. Even captured mercenaries, bloodied and on their knees under spear points, lifted their heads to watch. Above them, Blackthorn's awakened runes still burned along battlements and archways, and their glow answered the fire in Lyra's hands, as though the fortress itself had become witness to something older than war. Kael did not look away from her. Pain had hollowed the edges of his face. The poison was already doing its work. Silver dark lines spreading beneath his skin from the crossbow wound, threading toward his throat in cruel, sanctified veins. His left hand had gone half numb. His wolf, normally a massive, relentless presence inside him, felt distant for the first time in his adult life. Not gone, but being pulled backward behind walls of cold, priest-forged rot. It should have terrified him more than it did. Perhaps because Lyra's face was above him, fierce and focused and frightening, in ways no prayer had ever been. Perhaps because once a man had already chosen, fear lost some of its leverage. Lyra drew a breath. Then she burned. Not outward, inward. The fire sank into Kael's wound like sunlight poured into ice. His entire body arched. A savage sound tore from his throat before he could stop it. Part pain, part fury, part beast, answering violence with violence. Steam rose from beneath Lyra's hands. The silver poison writhed visibly under his skin, blackening and recoiling from the advancing dragonfire. Every instinct in her demanded more, harder, faster, annihilated. But she forced herself into control. Too much, and she would scorch living blood with dead venom. Too little, and the corruption would only retreat long enough to return deeper. So she followed it. Through flesh, through pulse, through the invisible line where wolf soul met human body. And there, she found the real wound. Not merely the bolt, a fracture older than the battle. A vow mark. Lyra's eyes widened. There, buried under Kael's bond to his wolf, lay an ancient scar not made by Seraphine's poison at all, but by something far older, a buried oath sigil, in the shape of a broken circle crossed by fang and flame. It had been dormant, hidden so deep that only dragonfire moving through a bonded body could expose it. A wolf rune layered over something older, not meant to protect, but to sever. Sever wolf kings from dragon blood forever. A blood law written into lineage itself. She sucked in a sharp breath. Kael felt the moment she touched the deeper mark and nearly blacked out. Not because it hurt more than the poison, but because it resonated with memory he had never consciously owned. Images flashed behind his eyes. Wolves kneeling in ash. A dragon queen wreathed in ruin. Men with crowns and priests with knives, swearing an oath over mingled blood. One king afraid enough of love, prophecy, or power to choose betrayal instead of alliance. Then the vision snapped away beneath the roar of Lyra's fire. She looked down at him, shaken in a way she had not been even while bleeding from the sky. "This was already in you," she whispered. Kael's jaw clenched against the pain. "What was?" Her hands stayed steady, but her voice dropped into stunned, dangerous certainty. "A severance vow, old as the first wolf crown. They didn't just hunt my bloodline, They marked yours. She pressed harder. Fire flared. Kael hissed through his teeth as a plume of dark vapor burst from the wound, carrying the stench of sanctified metal and something fouler, the old oath waking under pressure. Your kings were made to reject us, Lyra said. Not by chance, not by pride, by design. Around them, no one dared speak. The eastern yard had become an altar of revelation. Rowan, standing guard with blood on his armor, and Malrek chained at his feet, felt a cold shock pass through him. The priests, the councils, the old stories. So much of what wolves called history suddenly looked less like inheritance and more like tampering. Kael forced the words out between clenched teeth. Can you break it? Lyra's gaze lifted to his. For a moment, all the ruin, all the battle, all the watching soldiers disappeared. There was only the truth between them. Yes, she said. He did not hesitate. Then break it. She should have asked again. Should have warned him of the cost, of what it might do if the vow was tied to his bloodline, his crown, his beast. But Kael's face gave her no room for half-truths. He was trusting her not merely with his life now, but with the shape of the man he had been made to be. And if he could place that in her hands without flinching, she would not dishonor it by pretending safety remained part of the choice. Lyra closed her eyes and reached deeper. The dragonfire changed. Its color darkened from gold-white to something fiercer, edged in crimson and ash, the fire of inheritance rather than instinct. Blackthorn's runes answered in a sudden pulse across the walls. Beneath her palms, Kael's body shuddered violently as the old severance mark was dragged upward from the hidden line of his wolf bond and forced into visibility. It emerged beneath his skin in burning script along his collarbone and throat, a circle of oath runes, broken through by fang and flame, old enough to make even the oldest clan songs look recent. Gasps spread through the wolves watching. The mark writhed. Then Lyra spoke, not in the language of the court, not in the speech of wolf clans or southern nobility. Something older moved through her mouth, dragon tongue, or the remnants of whatever royal fire language had once governed the ash line before priests reduced it to legend. The words rolled low and resonant across the courtyard, and every flame present bowed toward her. Kael screamed. The mark ignited. For one terrible instant, it looked as if his entire chest had split open in fire. Then the severance vow tore free in sparks and black smoke, ripping out of him like a buried thorn of centuries. The poison came with it, dragged into the air in silver-dark tendrils. Lyra closed her hands. The fire clenched. What emerged from Kael's wound was not just venom. It was history made visible. Oath, ash, sanctified silver, old fear layered into blood law. Lyra held it suspended between her palms, a writhing knot of blackened silver script and poison smoke. Everyone in the yard saw it. No one would ever again be able to claim the divide between wolf and dragon had simply been natural. With one final breath, Lyra crushed the knot to ash. The fire went out. Kael collapsed forward. She caught him. The whole eastern yard seemed to stop beating. Then he inhaled, a harsh, brutal, glorious breath that hit like the first storm after drought. The change in him was immediate. The unnatural cold under his skin vanished. The numbness in his left arm broke apart in waves of returning pain and strength. And beneath it all, his wolf came back, not creeping, not wounded, but surging up through him with such force, his golden eyes flashed for a heartbeat before settling. The beast's presence slammed back into place with savage relief, no longer muffled by old law. Kael's body went rigid under the returning bond, then steadied. Lyra exhaled as if she had been holding up the entire keep. Her hands shook for the first time all night. Kael opened his eyes, and for one suspended, unguarded moment, they simply looked at each other. No court, no battle, no clan lords, no priests, just the impossible fact of survival, and the deeper, more dangerous fact of what had been uncovered between them. He saw the exhaustion carving shadows under her glowing eyes. She saw the raw gratitude he would rather die than voice in front of a crowd. The bond between them, cleared now of poison and old severance, blazed bright and clean as fresh forged steel. Malrek broke the silence with a hoarse laugh. Everyone turned. The traitor general was still kneeling in chains under Rowan's boot, face bloodied, ribs soaked dark, but his smile had returned, the smile of a man too proud to stop making himself useful to destruction even while losing. "So that's it," he coughed. "That's what they buried. Not monsters. A pact." His split lip curved. Wolves and dragons once crowned together. Kyle rose slowly from Lyra's arms and turned toward him. Malrek kept talking because dead men sometimes mistake relevance for immunity. First King of the North bound himself to the Ash Queen. Then one betrayed the other. The priests rewrote the rest. Everyone knows the bones of it, even if they pretend not to. He spat blood onto scorched stone. You think freeing one oath changes the North? It changes everything. Every lord here will tear at the realm for what comes next. Kale descended the crater edge one step at a time, sword still in his hand. "What comes next?" he said, voice flat and terrible. "Is that you die." Malrek's smile sharpened. "Then do it in front of them. Let the Dragon Queen watch you prove you are still wolf enough to kill for the throne." Kael stopped directly before him. Around them, warriors, nobles, healers and survivors held the silence like a held breath. Malrek wanted spectacle. Kyle understood that. Wanted the moment to become a story he could still contaminate with his own meaning. But Kyle had never been a man ruled by another's staging. He handed his sword to Rowan. The captain blinked once, then took it. Malrek's smile flickered. Kale crouched in front of the traitor until they were eye to eye. "You opened my gates," he said softly. "You put siege iron to my queen. You conspired with a noble too vain to understand war and priests too frightened to understand truth. And still, even now, you think this ends with theater." Malrek started to answer. Kyle's hand shot out and closed around his throat. What happened next was quick, brutal, animal. No blade, no proclamation, no martyrdom. Only the Alpha King's bare hand crushing the life out of the man who had brought civil war to his walls. Malrek fought, clawed, kicked once, then twice. Kyle did not move. The traitor's face darkened, eyes widening not just with pain but with the sudden comprehension that this death would not be poetic. It would be reduced to exactly what he had earned: elimination. When his body finally went slack, Kale let him drop, like refuse onto the scorched stone. No one spoke. No one needed to. The message was complete. Rowan stepped forward and dragged the corpse aside without ceremony. Kale turned then to Seraphine. She still knelt where Lyra had spared her, one hand at her bruised throat, the other braced on the stone like she no longer trusted the earth not to reject her too. The fury that had sustained her was gone. In its place was something uglier, the naked sight of a future collapsing. Malrek dead, the council exposed, Lyra alive, Kale standing, her own life spared not by victory, but by the mercy of the woman she had tried again and again to destroy. That was the wound she could not survive. Seraphine looked up at Kyle first, desperate enough to reach for the one illusion she had not fully surrendered. "I did it for the North," she whispered. No one believed her, not even herself. Kale did not answer. Lyra stepped forward instead. The whole courtyard tensed, but she did not burn, did not raise a hand. She only stood before Seraphine, wing torn, scales dark with blood, crown ridges catching firelight, and let the noblewoman see her clearly. "You did it," Lyra said. "For the future you thought I stole." Seraphine's lower lip trembled once, fury and humiliation warring in her face. "You were never meant to exist here." Lyra's expression did not change. "Neither was truth," she said. "Yet here we both are." Seraphine broke then, not theatrically, not sobbing in some dramatic collapse. Something quieter and far more final happened inside her gaze. The kind of internal collapse that comes when a person built entirely from entitlement and comparison is forced to stand alive in a world that no longer arranges itself around them. She lowered her eyes. For the first time in all the hours since Lyra entered Blackthorn as a bride, Seraphine had nothing left to throw. Kale spoke without looking away from Lyra. "Take her." Royal guards moved at once. Seraphine did not resist. They bound her hands and led her away through the smoking yard, a noblewoman walking into the long death of irrelevance. Some punishments required no blade. The eastern battle was over by then. The inner gate held. Malrek's surviving men had thrown down arms or fled. Blackthorn Keep still burned in places, but the fire belonged to repair now, not conquest. Healers moved among the wounded. Clan warriors gathered in uneasy knots, staring at Lyra, at Kale, at the glowing runes still visible on the walls. The question hanging over all of them was no longer whether the kingdom had changed. It was whether any of them would be allowed to pretend it had not. Lady Thessa arrived first among the clan lords, descending through the ash-filled yard with a handful of Frost-Hollow guards and the expression of a woman who had seen enough in one night to abandon denial as a strategy. Lord Varric followed, slower, huge, and scarred, and still not kneeling, but no longer speaking as though dragon blood alone settled anything. Behind them came the Redmaw twins and other lords, pale-faced and blood-marked from the battle, every one of them having personally watched Lyra hold fire with restraint, save the king, expose the old vow, and turn the tide of war. Facts were becoming inconvenient to prejudice. Good. Kale stood at the center of the crater's edge and faced them. No throne, no council chair, just blackened stone and moonlight, and the truth. Lady Thessa inclined her head first. It was not submission. It was acknowledgement. The fortress answered her blood, she said. And the old vow was real. Kale nodded once. Yes. Lord Varric's heavy gaze fixed on Lyra. If what was buried between our lines is true, then wolves have been ruled by lies older than the crown. His lip curled, not at her this time, but at the implication itself. I do not like that. Neither do I, Kale said. Varric's eyes shifted to him. And yet, you stand with her. I do. The old warlord looked back at Lyra. Long enough that lesser wolves near him tensed, uncertain whether insult or oath would come next. At last, Varric gave a rough snort. Then I'll say this plainly. She bled for the keep, burned our enemies, not our backs. That matters. He looked to Kale again. If she stays, many will fear her. If she leaves, more will come for her, and the ones who survive will come for us next. I prefer enemies I can see. For a man like Varric, it was nearly an endorsement. The Redmaw twins exchanged a glance, and for once, seemed clever enough to follow power rather than gossip. One bowed shallowly. The other copied him. Lady Thessa looked at Lyra directly. Can you control it? She asked, meaning the fire, the blood, the sky, the fear, perhaps all of it. Lyra's torn wing twitched behind her. Pain flashed across her face and vanished. Yes, she said. Not perfectly, not tonight, but yes. The answer was honest. That helped more than promises would have. Thessa nodded. Then the realm has fewer reasons to panic than rumor will prefer. She turned to the lords. Spread that. No one argued. Not because fear was gone, because leadership had already moved. And once momentum hardened, smart wolves rarely threw themselves under it. The clan lords withdrew to gather their people and contain the story before dawn twisted it further. The yard gradually emptied, leaving only the wounded, the dead, the loyal, and the two figures at the center of every future consequence. Kyle and Lyra stood facing one another amid the ruin. Without the battle noise, exhaustion hit harder. Lyra's shoulders dipped by a fraction. The torn wing behind her trembled with strain. Fire no longer streamed from her automatically, but embers still drifted from her skin in quiet, intermittent breaths. She looked like a kingdom's answer, and a wounded woman at once. Kyle saw all of it. You should be tended, he said. She almost smiled. So should you. He glanced at the blood still on his armor, at the scorched gap where Seraphine's bolt had struck. I've had worse. I know, she said. The softness in the words surprised them both. He stepped closer. Not much. just enough to force honesty into the space between them. "When this night began," he said, "you were brought here as tribute. Then I shamed you before the court. Then I asked you to trust me with chaos." His gaze held hers steadily. "You had every reason to let this fortress burn." Lyra's eyes lowered once, then rose again. "Part of me wanted to. Part of me would have deserved it." That pulled a real breath of disbelief from her. Kings rarely say things like that. "I rarely mean them." Something fragile and dangerous moved between them then. Not peace, not yet, but the possibility of something built on spoken truth rather than arranged convenience. That possibility frightened her, almost as much as the old dragon power had, because power could be learned. Trust had to be chosen again and again. Kael looked beyond her briefly, to the waking ruins of Blackthorn, to the place where the crater had split the courtyard, to the wolves carrying their dead past dragon-marked walls. Then he looked back at her, and when he spoke again, the words were no longer meant just for the moment. They were for what came after. "The council will want exile at minimum," he said. "Some will want marriage. Some will want imprisonment, disguised as protection. Some will still want your death, and pretend they call it necessity." His expression hardened. "None of them will decide this for me." Lyra went very still. "And you?" she asked. He did not answer immediately, which made the answer matter more. Finally he said, "I want you to stay." The words landed with the weight of everything not said before them. She searched his face carefully. "As what?" "Not bride, not captive, not treaty, not weapon." Kyle took another step closer until the space between them was so narrow the heat from her skin touched his armor. "As queen," he said. The courtyard itself seemed to quiet around the word. Lyra blinked once, as if the title had struck her harder than any blade. "You barely know me." "I know enough." His jaw tightened. "I know what you choose under pressure. I know what you spared when vengeance would have been easy. I know what you protected when you had every right to destroy." He drew a breath. "And I know that when they tried to poison what I am, you cut the lie out rather than let me become less." Her throat worked. "That isn't the same as love," she said very quietly. "No," Kael agreed. "It isn't." The honesty of it nearly undid her more than poetry would have. "But it is not nothing," he added. No, she thought. It was not nothing. It was far too much to be nothing. He lifted his hand, slower this time, giving her room for refusal. His fingers hovered just below her jaw, where scale faded into skin. Lyra did not pull away. The touch, when it came, was careful enough to feel like a vow, still deciding its own shape. "I'm not asking you to stay because the kingdom demands a symbol," he said. "I'm asking because I would rather build a realm with the woman who survived fire than rule a quiet lie without her." The words went through her like light through old stained glass, illuminating wounds rather than hiding them. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, Lyra felt the terrible, unfamiliar sensation of being wanted, not as a price, not as a vessel, not as an answer to prophecy, but as herself. It scared her. So of course she told the truth. "If I stay," she said, "your realm will never be quiet again." A corner of Kael's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something rarer. Recognition. "Good." She laughed, then small, exhausted, half incredulous, half broken open by relief she did not yet trust. The sound barely lasted a breath, but it changed the night. Changed him. Changed her. Perhaps that was how kingdoms truly turned. Not only in battles and declarations, but in the moment two wounded sovereigns realized they were no longer alone inside the future. Lyra looked up at the keep, at the ruins, at the walls that had tried to contain her and then answered her blood instead. Then back at Kael. "I won't kneel as a prisoner," she said. "I wouldn't let you. I won't be hidden when your lords grow frightened. They'll learn. I won't be less so your priests can sleep." At that, something dark and approving flashed in his eyes. "Neither will I." A long silence followed. Then, slowly, deliberately, Lyra inclined her head. Not submission. Acceptance. For tonight, she said. I stay. It was not forever. It was not a vow of love. It was not surrender. It was, perhaps, more valuable than any of those things. A first real choice, freely given. Kale bowed his head the slightest degree in return, honoring it for what it was. Above them, dawn had not yet come, but the eastern sky had begun to pale by a breath. Blackthorn. Keep still smoked. The dead still needed burying. Councils still needed breaking. Histories needed ripping open. Priests needed answering. And somewhere beyond the battered walls, the wider world would soon learn that the ash line lived, that the Alpha King had chosen her, and that old blood laws were burning out of the stone. War, in other words, had only begun. But for this moment, in the scorched heart of the fortress, Lyra stood wrapped in the aftermath of fire and choice, while Kale remained beside her, not as jailer, not as reluctant king, but as the first person in either of their broken histories to offer power without chains. And when the first pale line of dawn finally touched the highest tower of Blackthorn Keep, the Dragon Queen and the Wolf King were still standing together in the ruins. Not healed, not forgiven, not finished, but chosen. Morning came to Blackthorn. Keep like a survivor returning to a battlefield it no longer recognized. The fires had been contained before dawn, but the fortress still carried the scent of smoke in every corridor and courtyard. Stone walls blackened by dragonfire gleamed faintly under the first gray wash of daylight. Broken battlements waited beneath draped canvas. Blood had been scrubbed from the eastern yard, though not well enough to fool anyone with memory. And everywhere, from servant passages to guard towers to the long northern bridge, one truth had spread ahead of the sunrise like a new law. The old world had failed to stop. The cursed bride had not died. The Dragon Queen had risen, and the Alpha King had chosen her in front of the entire kingdom. No rumor in Blackthorn that morning was stronger than that one. Servants whispered it while carrying basins through the lower halls. Healers repeated it in quieter tones over wounded warriors. Young guards in half-dented armor argued over whether they had seen Lyra call fire from the stone itself, or whether the fortress had answered her first. Clan retainers sent hurried riders back to their packed territories before breakfast, each message carrying some version of the same impossible account. Even those who still hated the truth had been forced to witness enough of it that denial could no longer stand upright without looking ridiculous. And in the highest chamber of the western royal wing, Lyra stood before a tall, iron-framed mirror and watched a stranger slowly become visible inside her own reflection. Her wing had been bound, not hidden. Bound. The healer, Kale, had sent a grim, capable older woman named Marin, whose loyalty belonged not to priests, but to the crown itself, had spent the last hours cleaning the torn membrane, setting the damaged joint as best she could, and applying salves that hissed when dragon heat touched them. The pain remained, deep and bright as a blade left in the bone, but it no longer threatened to make her collapse every time she breathed. The scales along Lyra's throat and shoulders had not vanished with dawn. That had been one of the first things she checked. They remained where her body now seemed to prefer them. Elegant dark, bronze arcs at the collarbones, fine ash, gold tracing the spine and forearms, a subtle living map of a truth, no washing and no silk would erase. Her eyes, when not inflamed by battle or bond or rage, had returned mostly to their human shade, but not entirely. There was a reddish warmth in them now, deep beneath the brown, as if embers lived behind her gaze and might brighten at any provocation. She looked less like a curse this morning than like a sentence history had tried and failed to finish. Behind her, folded over a carved chair, lay the gown Kale had ordered brought for the morning assembly. Not white, not bridal, not soft. It was made of deep black fabric, layered over dark crimson, cut in long royal lines rather than decorative sweetness, with a high collar clasped in antique gold and sleeves, fitted for movement rather than ornament. At the shoulders, the seam had been altered overnight to accommodate the structure of her wings. Someone Marin, perhaps, or one of the silent seamstresses who had worked while Lyra dozed in broken fragments of sleep, had even sewn a subtle pattern of scaled embroidery along the cuffs. Not mockery. Recognition. A queen's garment. Lyra stared at it too long. Then she looked back at her reflection. For most of her life, clothing had been chosen for her by people trying either to minimize her, hide her, display her, or humiliate her. That had been the shape of survival. Blend in enough to be tolerable. Stay quiet enough to avoid the next punishment. Lower your eyes. Keep your shoulders small. Try not to make the room remember you are there. The woman in the mirror no longer had that option. Something inside her recoiled at the thought of stepping into the great hall again. The memory of kneeling in torn white under the eyes of nobles while Kyle's rejection carved through the court remained painfully alive. The thought of returning there not as a prisoner, but as something far more visible felt less like triumph than exposure. Yet beneath that fear was another truth. If she hid now, they would call it shame. If she trembled, they would call it weakness. If she stood, they would at least be forced to call it what it was: choice. A knock sounded at the chamber door. Not loud, just once. Lyra turned. For a breath she considered not answering, which was ridiculous given that anyone allowed in this wing would enter whether invited or not. But the old instinct still rose first. Brace. Prepare. Disguise the vulnerable thing before someone sees it. She had lived too long in rooms where footsteps meant priests, gossip, orders, or punishment. Come, she said. The door opened. Kale entered alone. The sight of him struck her strangely hard. He had changed armor since the battle, but only partly. He wore black again, though lighter now, more suited for command within walls than open war. The wound Seraphine had given him had been bound tightly beneath dark leather and silver-clasped straps, and his left shoulder moved with the careful stiffness of a man who refused to admit how badly anything hurt. A fresh line of healing skin cut across his brow. He looked like he had slept very little, which, knowing him, likely meant not at all. Yet the first thing Lyra noticed was not injury. It was the absence. The old hidden tension she had glimpsed beneath him, some deep-buried harshness at the seam between instinct and restraint, was gone. Or perhaps not gone, but altered. The severance mark broken out of him the night before had left him somehow more wholly himself. Hard still, dangerous still, but no longer split by a law written into his blood without consent. His wolf moved beneath his skin now with clear force, not that muffled half-distance she had felt before. He closed the door behind him and took in the room, the mirror, the untouched gown, and finally her. For one suspended second neither spoke. Then Kale said, "You should be resting." Lyra let one brow lift faintly. "You're dressed for a royal assembly while bleeding through fresh bandages." He glanced down at himself, as if only just remembering his body had been injured. "That's different. It always is. For kings." Something very near amusement touched his face and disappeared again. Only when they're being lectured by dragon queens before sunrise. That pulled a brief breath of laughter from her, surprising them both. The sound was quieter than the one in the ruined yard, less sharpened by exhaustion, but no less dangerous in what it did to the air between them. Kale's gaze shifted almost imperceptibly, as though the laugh had struck him somewhere he was not used to leaving undefended. He stepped closer, but not so close that she would need to decide whether to retreat. "The clan lords are gathered," he said. "The remaining council members too. Priests, captains, household witnesses. They wanted a public accounting before word spreads farther south." Lyra's eyes drifted to the gown again. "And you intend to give them one?" "Yes." She was silent for a moment. Then, without looking at him, she asked, "Do you regret it?" Kyle still. He knew at once. She did not mean the battle, did not mean Seraphine, Malrek, or even the public declaration on the battlements. She meant everything. Rejecting her before the court, choosing her after the fire, binding the kingdom to a woman whose existence might redraw its history, asking her to stay, calling her queen. Perhaps most dangerously, she meant whatever lived between them now, that truth had made it impossible to return to distance. Kyle answered as he always did, when he meant the answer. I regret the part where I was a fool, he said, not the part where I stopped being one. That landed deeper than he could know. Lyra turned fully toward him. In the morning light filtering through the tall western windows, he could see the fatigue she carried more clearly than firelight had allowed, the tension at the corners of her eyes, the way her bound wing was held slightly away from the body to avoid pain, the instinctive readiness in her posture that said her mind was still living half a breath ahead of danger. But he could also see the steadiness beneath it, the refusal to fold, the quiet strength that had survived years of containment without becoming brittle. He wondered, not for the first time, who she would have been in a world that had not begun by fearing her. Perhaps she read some version of that thought on his face, because her voice softened when she said, I don't know how to walk into that hall as if I belong there. Kyle did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the last few steps between them and stopped beside the chair holding the gown. He lifted it once, inspected the altered seams at the shoulders, then set it back down with surprising care. You don't have to walk in as if you belong there, he said. You have to walk in knowing they no longer decide it. She looked at him, searching for ceremony, comfort, false confidence. He gave her none of those. Only truth. For years they made you perform smallness so they could remain comfortable, he continued. Let them be uncomfortable now. Something in her eased. Not all the way. Not enough to call it peace, but enough that the room stopped feeling like a cage. Kael's gaze moved to the mirror behind her, catching both their reflections at once. The Wolf King scarred and half-healed. The Dragon Queen in a borrowed dawn, still marked by battle, still deciding what form survival would take next. I'll enter first, he said. They'll expect that. Then you come when the herald calls. His voice lowered by a degree. And Lyra, she waited. When you walk in, don't look at the floor. The instruction was simple. It hit her harder than any elaborate reassurance would have, because the floor had always been where she had been told to place her eyes. At punishments, at ceremonies, at accusations, at every moment when someone stronger wanted her to remember where she belonged relative to them. She held his gaze. All right, she said. Kael nodded once. Then, surprising her, he reached out and touched the edge of the black crimson gown, not her skin, not even her hand, just the cloth that would soon become a symbol in 100 mouths, and said quietly, You won't wear white for them again. No, she would not. When he left, Lyra stood alone for a moment longer in the chamber with the lingering warmth of his presence and the echo of that simple instruction. Don't look at the floor. Then she dressed. The gown fit as though it had been waiting for the shape of her all along. The black deepened the bronze of her scales rather than hiding them. The crimson lining flashed when she moved, like banked flame beneath dark stone. The high collar framed the lines of her throat with stark royal severity, and the altered shoulders let her bound wing and folded uninjured one settle without awkward disguise. Maren returned to fasten the last clasps and secure a narrow piece of black metalwork through Lyra's hair, not a crown. Not yet, but something old and severe that gave no ground to softness. When the healer stepped back, she looked at Lyra with the blunt appraisal of a woman too seasoned for flattery. Well, Maren said, they'll either kneel or choke. Lyra blinked, then laughed. The healer's mouth twitched once in satisfaction. Much better, she muttered, and left. By the time the herald summoned her, the fortress had fully woken. Servants lined the outer corridor with lowered heads and stolen glances. Royal guards in fresh formation stood along the passage leading from the western wing to the great hall, their spears upright, faces carefully controlled. Some looked uncertain, some afraid. A few, especially among those who had fought in the eastern yard, looked at her with something closer to fierce respect. None looked at her with pity. That, more than anything else, told her the night had truly changed something. The herald bowed low. My lady, he said, voice tight with nerves and ceremony. The king awaits. The title caught strangely under her ribs. Not because it was new, because no one had ever spoken it without irony before. Lyra followed. The walk to the great hall seemed both impossibly long and over in a breath. She heard the assembly before she saw it. The low murmur of noble voices contained by tension, the scrape of armor, the rustle of robes, the hush that falls whenever a room full of people realizes history is about to step through a doorway they cannot close again. At the far end of the passage, the carved double doors of the hall stood shut, the same doors through which she had entered the night before as an offering, the same threshold across which she had walked into humiliation. For one terrible instant, memory tightened, like chains around her ribs. Kyle's voice returned to her then, low and clear, as if spoken beside her ear. "When you walk in, don't look at the floor." The herald struck the staff once. The doors opened. The great hall of Blackthorn Keep had been half restored overnight, but not disguised. Burn marks still scarred the western side. One of the towering windows remained shattered, curtained now in dark cloth where moonlight had broken through. The cracked marble from the wedding had been covered with long runners of black, and the broken obsidian throne had not yet been replaced. In its absence, Kale stood before the dais rather than seated above it, which made the room feel less like a court and more like a battlefield under rules. Every eye in the hall turned toward the doors. Lyra entered, and she did not look down. She looked through them, at the lords in furs and iron, at the nobles whose mouths had once curled around whispers, at the remaining council members, pale and rigid under the weight of exposure, at the priests who dared not meet her eyes for long, at Lady Thessa, still and watchful, at Lord Varric, arms folded, expression like carved stone, at Rowan, standing near the king with his hands clasped behind him and blood still not entirely out from under one thumbnail, at the servants lining the edges of the chamber, trying not to stare, and failing beautifully, and finally, at Kyle. He stood in black beneath the broken space where his throne should have been, not above the room, but against it, waiting. When Lyra reached the center of the hall, she stopped. No one had instructed her where exactly to stand. No one needed to. The space beside Kael remained open. The whole hall saw her choose it. A whisper ran through the nobles and died instantly under Kyle's gaze. The king stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, carried through the hall with the same effortless authority it had in the council chamber and on the battlements, but there was something else in it now, too. Something forged by the night's revelations and stripped of old inherited lies. "Hear me," he said, "and hear me only once. What happened in Blackthorn last night was not the rise of a curse, but the exposure of a history this realm was taught to forget. Lyra Vale of the Ash Line was brought here under false silence, marked by priests, hidden by cowards, and endangered by traitors within my own walls. She defended this keep when those same traitors opened its gates. She saved my life when sanctified poison meant for the crown should have killed me. And in the process, the blood law buried between wolf and dragon was made visible before witnesses from every major clan." He turned slowly, letting his gaze pin every faction in the room. "That law is broken." No one moved. Somewhere in the back of the hall, one of the younger nobles inhaled too sharply and was immediately hushed by someone wiser. Kael continued, "The council that concealed it will be dismantled and remade. Every priest or lord found complicit in the abuse of that oath or the persecution of the Ash bloodline will answer to the crown. Malrek is dead. Seraphine of Iron Fang has been stripped of standing and awaits judgment. The Eastgate traitors will hang before sundown." His tone never rose. It did not need to. Then he did something more dangerous than threats. He spoke the future aloud. "From this day, no law in the North will name dragon blood as corruption by default. No child will be bound, hidden, or condemned under priest. Made fear because old men preferred the safety of a lie. That caused a visible shift. Not in the lords who already understood power. In the others, the ones who had expected containment, compromise, or carefully worded postponement. Kael gave them none. Good." Lady Thessa inclined her head first. Then Varric, after a long, brutal pause that looked almost like reluctance wrestling instinct, bowed his head as well. The gesture rolled outward. One clan after another followed. Not always deeply, not always gracefully, but enough. Enough that the room could feel the tide changing shape beneath its feet. Only one old priest dared step forward. He was thin, white-haired, and furious in the way men often become when the world stops agreeing to orbit their certainty. "Your Majesty," he said, voice trembling between outrage and terror. "With respect, you move too quickly. Blood such as hers has never been safely integrated into the sacred order of the wolf realm. There must be caution, ritual consultation, separation, until the footnote." Kyle did not let him finish. "No." The word cut cleanly through the chamber. The priest faltered. Kale took one step closer, not enough to be called threatening by the timid, but more than enough for anyone with sense to understand the danger. "You had centuries for caution," he said. "What you practiced instead was fear, dressed as holiness. I will not hear appeals to sacred order from men whose order required children to be sealed and women to be hunted." The priest went silent. Kale turned away from him and back toward the hall. Then, before anyone could recover or reposition or find a smaller lie to hide inside, he did the one thing that ended ambiguity forever. He reached for Lyra's hand, not hidden at his side, not in the chaos of war, in broad daylight, in the center of the hall, before every noble, guard, servant, healer, and priest. His hand closed around hers. Warm, steady, public. The chamber drew a collective breath. "This is Lyra Vale," he said, and now his voice carried something no one in the room had heard from him before. Not softness, never softness exactly, but conviction sharpened by something deeper than political necessity. "She stands beside me by right of blood, by right of battle, and by my choosing. Until she says otherwise, Blackthorn is her home, and this crown will answer for her as it answers for itself." The weight of those words landed everywhere at once. Home, not custody, not alliance, not tolerance. Home. Lyra felt the room shift around the word like stone cracking under thaw. The bond between her and Kale, steadied under the warmth of his grip, not demanding anything, not rushing anything, simply present clean now, no longer distorted by old laws or poison. He turned then, not to the hall, but to her. The whole great chamber stood frozen around them. And because Kyle had apparently decided he was done offering her only half choices, he said for all of them to hear, "I asked you to stay last night." Lyra's heart kicked once, hard enough that the edges of her wing ached with the motion. Kyle's gaze did not leave hers. "I am asking again now," he said. "Not because the realm requires a symbol, not because fate bound us and expects obedience, not because I need peace with your bloodline or power through your fire." He drew one breath, and the hall seemed to lean with him. "I am asking because I want you beside me when this kingdom becomes honest enough to deserve you." Silence. Then, deeper silence. Then the kind of stillness that only falls when everyone present realizes they are witnessing something more dangerous than politics. Truth. Lyra had spent years imagining what vindication might feel like. She had imagined courts begging forgiveness, enemies kneeling, priests exposed, cruel women broken, the old savage fantasies that keep a hunted thing alive. But she had never imagined this, being wanted in full daylight, not as weapon, not as proof, not as myth, as herself. Her hand tightened slightly in his. The room waited. Kale waited. And because she had promised herself last night that if she stayed, it would not be kneeling, she answered the only way she could live with. "I will stay," she said, voice clear enough to reach the back of the hall, "but not as something your court can display when it wants strength and hide when it wants comfort." A flicker of something fierce and almost proud moved through Kyle's expression. "Good," Lyra went on, the words rising from somewhere deeper than fear now. "I will not be softened for your priests. I will not be silenced for your lords. I will not shrink so your history can remain pretty." "No," Kale said, without looking away. "You won't." The answer steadied her, so she gave the rest. "If I stay," she said, "then I stay as what I am." Kale's thumb brushed once across her knuckles, where their hands were joined a small private motion hidden inside a public vow. As queen, he said. This time the title did not hit her like a wound. It hit like a door opening. Around them, the hall shifted again. Some faces hardened, some softened. Some lords recalculated futures in real time. Servants blinked rapidly, as if trying to memorize the exact shape of the morning so they could tell it later to children who would not believe them. Rowan looked suspiciously pleased. Lady Thessa's gaze sharpened with approval. Varric gave a grunt that might have been the wolf equivalent of surrender to inevitability. The old priest lowered his head, not in reverence, in defeat. Good. Kael released Lyra's hand, only long enough to turn and face the hall once more. Kneel, he said. He did not shout it. He did not need to. The entire chamber dropped. Not all at once. Not elegantly, but inevitably. Lords in fur and iron bent knee. Nobles followed. Guards struck fist to chest and lowered heads. Servants went down last, wide-eyed and trembling, not from terror this time, but because they understood what none of the old songs had prepared them for. They were watching a realm revise itself in a single posture. Lyra remained standing, beside Kael, above the bowed heads of the court that had once expected her to kneel forever. No one in that hall would ever forget it. The formalities that followed mattered politically. Oaths, orders, the naming of temporary regions for council seats soon to be stripped, public witness statements about Malrek and Seraphine, decrees regarding the priests under investigation. All necessary, all sharp, all moving pieces of a morning that would keep historians employed for generations. But the real center of it had already happened. By the time the assembly broke, Blackthorn's corridors were no longer whispering about whether Lyra would stay. They were whispering what to call the age that began when she did. Later, much later after the hall had emptied, after the clan lords had scattered to send sealed orders and loyal riders across the northern territories, after Rowan had dragged 3 different trembling administrators into service, because someone still had to make a wounded fortress function, Lyra found herself once again on the western battlements. The same battlements from which she had taken the sky and fire. Now the day was pale and cold, the wind carrying the smoke of repair crews rather than battle. Below, Blackthorn Keep was moving in the purposeful exhaustion that follows survival. Men rebuilt. Women counted supplies. Healers crossed courtyards. The dead were being prepared with honor. The east gate remained shattered, but work had already begun around it. Wolves, she was learning, believed strongly in mending while still bleeding. Kael found her there. Of course he did. He came to stand beside her without announcing himself, his presence recognizable now through bond and instinct before sound. For a time they said nothing. They looked out over the battered keep, the northern forests beyond it, the hard horizon where future trouble was already gathering. It's quieter, Lyra said at last. For now. She glanced sideways at him. That sounded almost hopeful. He gave her a look. Don't spread it around. A smile tugged at her mouth despite herself. Wind caught the edges of her dark gown and tugged lightly at the bound wing behind her. She winced before she could hide it. Kyle noticed instantly. You should be sitting, and you should be unconscious. Noted. Silence again. Not awkward this time. Something easier. Stranger. More dangerous for that exact reason. After a while, Lyra said without looking at him, When you asked me in the hall, were you truly asking me to stay because you wanted me there? Kyle leaned both forearms on the cold stone parapet and considered the forest line as if the answer lived somewhere in the pines. I am not practiced in saying ornamental things, he said. I've noticed. That was not ornamental. She turned toward him fully then. The daylight showed him more clearly than firelight had. The weariness around the eyes, the tension he still wore like armor even at rest, the scar at his brow, the healing beneath the collar, where her fire had burned, old law out of his blood. He looked, she realized, like a man who had survived his own history only recently enough to still distrust the air. What then? She asked. Kyle looked back at her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, when I thought you were dead in the courtyard, there was nothing in me that remained king first. The words were so simple that they cut deeper than grand declarations could have. Lyra's breath caught. He continued before she could answer, as if stopping now would make continuing harder. I have spent my life sorting people by threat, usefulness, loyalty, and weakness. It has kept me alive. It has kept this kingdom intact. But somewhere between your blood on the wedding hall floor and your hands over my wound in the eastern yard, you stopped being any of those categories. His gaze held hers, unwavering. You became the one person I could not reduce. The world seemed to still around the sentence. Below them, hammers struck stone. Somewhere a raven called. Wind moved along the battlements and through the furled edges of Lyra's bound wing. She said very softly, "That sounds dangerously close to feeling." Probably. That made her laugh again, helplessly this time, and the sound warmed the cold battlement more effectively than sunlight. Kyle's mouth shifted. Yes, unmistakably now, the brief shadow of a smile. It transformed his face in ways she was not prepared for, and therefore chose not to examine too closely. Not yet. Lyra turned back toward the horizon. My life has taught me that when people want something powerful, they either cage it or worship it. Neither one is love. No. She drew a slow breath. I don't know what this is yet. Kale did not insult her with certainty he could not own. Neither do I, he said. Then, after a pause, but I would rather learn it with you than return to what I was before. There it was again. Truth, not polished, not safe, not wrapped in poetry. And somehow, because of that, more intimate than any rehearsed vow. Lyra looked at him, really looked, and saw not the king on the throne or the warrior in the courtyard, but the man who had rejected her when old law still moved invisibly through him, then chosen her when truth made that choice costly, and kept choosing since. Not flawlessly, not gently, but deliberately. Perhaps that was enough for a beginning. Slowly, mindful of her wing and his wound, and the impossible tenderness of motion after so much violence, she lifted her hand and touched the side of his jaw. He went very still. The scar at his brow was rougher than the rest of his skin. The line of his face under her palm was hard with discipline, but warmer than the morning air. Through the bond she felt the sharp flare his control could not fully conceal. Not surprise, though there was some of that. Something deeper. Want, yes. Relief, dangerously enough. And the strange, solemn happiness of a man receiving something he had not expected to be given freely. You are still very difficult, she said. A real smile touched him then, brief and lethal and unexpectedly human. So are you. Good. Yes, he said, voice lower now. Good. He lifted his hand and covered hers where it rested against his face. No claim. No force. Just contact. The kind that says, I know this is a gift, not a right. Then, because the kingdom was still wounded, and the future still ugly, and perhaps precisely because of that, Kale bent and pressed his forehead lightly to hers. No audience. No decree. No courtly spectacle. Just the quiet meeting of two scarred sovereigns on a cold battlement above a fortress that had nearly died, and somehow become truer by surviving. Lyra closed her eyes. For one perfect, precarious heartbeat, the world held. When they finally pulled apart, the distance between them felt altered in a way words could not undo. Below, Blackthorn Keep kept rebuilding. Beyond, the north waited uneasily for its next command. And somewhere farther still, other kingdoms would already be hearing impossible stories and sharpening their responses. There would be war again. Politics. Betrayals not yet discovered. Old enemies emerging from histories thought buried. The ash lines surviving secrets. The wolf crown's corrupted records. Southern provinces ready to claim, fear, or exploit what had awakened. Enough danger to feed a dozen more tales. But those belonged to what came next. This story, for now, ended where the best stories often do not with peace, but with promise. The cursed bride did not remain cursed. The Alpha King did not remain blind. The fortress that had once opened its doors for a political sacrifice opened them now for a queen. And the realm that had been built on the lie that wolves and dragons could only destroy one another was forced at last to witness a far more dangerous truth. Sometimes, the fire that unmakes a kingdom is the very same fire that teaches it how to live. In the days that followed, songs would call her many things. The Ash Queen, the Winged Luna, the Bride of Blackthorn, the Dragon on the Wolf Wall. But the name that mattered most was the one spoken first, not by bards, lords, or frightened priests, but by the man who had once rejected her, and then learned, too late and exactly in time, who she really was. Queen. And when the next storm finally came for Blackthorn Keep, as storms always do for places that choose truth over comfort, it would find them not as king and captive, not as ruler and symbol, but standing exactly as Dawn had first witnessed them in the ruins. Chosen,